Well, why don't we get into it? I'm really pleased. I think we're all very excited to welcome Thought Slime, also Matt or Stink Matt, who makes leftist edutainment videos on the internets for the people. We are super fans, actually. We very much enjoy your content.
I wanted to play it cool, but we're also like heavily super fans. I've watched your entire Thought Slime channel. Not all of Scaredy Cats, but everything on Thought Slime besides not the lives, but the main videos.
Yeah. Awesome. That's cool.
Yeah, I even watched Society on your recommendation from your horror.
You're welcome.
A lot of fun.
And that we noticed in the course of, it's gotten to the point where oftentimes we'll like message because we have a group signal, like people will just like casually drop in like, oh, Thought Slime was saying this on this video. So it's definitely like you're an inspiration for all of us. But we couldn't help but notice that every once in a while, even on videos that weren't named psychedelics, you'd have an aside that gestured towards your interest in the subject of psychedelics. And so we figured that we would reach out. This is actually like a long time dream to get in touch with you. So this is really cool for us. And we were also just, we'll get into this a bit more in the discussion, but the field of psychedelics in the course of this mainstreaming stuff that's been going on recently in the psychedelic renaissance is pervasively saturated with reactionary and far-right forces, to center right, but that's the bulk of what's there, to the point that our ideas are often delegitimized just with people saying, oh, they're just leftist, like don't pay attention to, like as if that saying that you're a leftist. Yeah. So we feel, like you were saying in one of your videos about sports, you don't want to cede sports, which so many people are interested in, to the far right. We don't want to like just passively allow psychedelics, which is such a fascinating subject, to be populated with reactionary ideas. So we were trying to think about how to connect to the left more broadly as a way of kind of thinking through how to address this fact of the reactionary right coming into psychedelia and capitalism and psychedelia more generally. So that's the big picture. And I'll let someone else kind of get into the sub.
The rise of BreadTube has been like a welcome and interesting development. All of us have been involved in both psychedelics and like left politics of some sort for many, many years. And so this is, there's a couple of things that's going on, very much what Nishay was talking about in terms of like, it's not just that the psychedelics field is being, mainstreamed and populated with sort of corporate interests, but also, the process of actively courting the right is like an avowed and openly stated strategy of some of the most high profile popularizers and reformers in psychedelics, namely the Multidisciplinary Association for Psychedelic Study. And so, we have spent a lot of time critiquing that. And anyhow, what Nishay was saying is something that we've been talking about for really probably the majority of the time that we have been a nonprofit. That we would like to sort of reach out to those who are already working on making the world sort of a harder place to have a bad trip in general.
It's interesting that you talk about this idea of de-radicalizing the far right, because that is also something that is very much a hotly debated issue on left YouTube right now, about whether that's the appropriate strategy. And I tend to fall on the side of not really. I think that our energy is better spent reaching out to the type of people who are victimized by the far right than trying to mollycoddle the far right and get them to say slurs less, as though that represents meaningful change.
Absolutely.
And in terms of psychedelics, like, there's this like thousands-year-old history of indigenous use of psychedelics that like we could look to that as a model rather than like Joe Rogan might be, you know.
Yeah, I mean, my own sort of trajectory has put me in contact with several indigenous communities, mostly like the Maya and a bit of a stint in the Amazon. And like, honestly, sitting at some peyote fires was part of the reason why I started to be a more like public advocate for these things, mainly because it was so like wholesome. It was not stigmatized. It was a literal family affair. So yeah, of course we can learn things from the people who have been carrying this torch since the beginning.
Yeah, maybe we could do like a quick like go around of just like where we each come from. Because Pace, you're an ecologist. I have a comparative literature PhD. I did my academic work is studying the literature of trip reports, but also I'm non-binary, queer, autistic, like lots of in-between identities that made it hard for me to kind of fit in when I was growing up. And then taking psychedelics, like it just clicked for me. Like, oh, I don't need to be different than I am. It's okay to kind of be whatever it is that I am and stop being so anxious about not being like everyone else and that sort of thing. So that it really changed my life. In college, like I had this experience that was the most profound experience of my life. And it was an experience I wasn't supposed to have. And that just didn't sit right with me. So I kind of stuck with it. I've written about coming out of the psychedelic closet as an intersectional practice of joining forces with the queer community, different ethnicities, fighting for, as you were saying about in your videos about anarchism as a sort of big tent, intersectional approach to being against oppression of all kinds, and not specific named sorts of oppression, but just getting rid of oppression and unjust hierarchies, et cetera. That's something I really feel like there's a lot of potential in psychedelics to kind of work towards those ends and to decondition people from the entrenched hierarchies and stuff that they've been grown up with. But David and Ross, I don't know if you want to add anything.
Well, I guess there's plenty. I guess I'd ask if Matt wants to chime in with some of his. Perhaps I have some impression of earlier experiences lending some lenses or towards critical analysis or a sense of like systemic issues based on some of the comments that you'd made in the past, or am I?
Well, I mean, for me, I think it was mostly working a series of shitty jobs. Oh, sorry. Am I allowed to swear?
Yes, absolutely.
Oh, yeah.
Please have at it.
Go for it.
Forget to ask. I always forget to ask until I'm in the moment, and then but yeah, I think I've covered all of them now on the channel. But,
Yeah.
It was this. I will say that. I'm a little intimidated now, realizing how educated everyone else on the panel is, because I am a university dropout. I did not finish my bachelor's degree, and I was just like a neat, cruising through life with like just a series of retail work and just like soul crushing jobs over and over, and just really feeling like, yeah. I just really feeling like, like there was no place in the world for me. Yeah, that's kind of what led me to where I am.
Sure. And I guess, and apologies if I'm mapping some of my own stuff onto you. But in the psychedelics episode, I thought I recalled something along the lines of sort of commentary about not wanting to seed some of this stuff to sort of the tech bros and the like, because of some of the potentials there, which reminded me. So like for me, like my first mushroom experience, sort of after having 10 to 15 minutes of just like pure existential presence, and with that sort of the loss of existential terror around death that I'd carried since like my earliest memories were tied to my grandma passing, sort of like having that evaporate. And then as I came down, while still very much tripping, having this experience of understandings of capitalism, industrial civilization, my role at school to get papers, to participate in that sort of questions of how can I opt out? Oh shit, I can't actually opt out, you know, even if I eke out some sort of existence on the edge of a national forest. When the life support systems on Spaceship Earth fail, I'm just as fucked as everyone else. So cool, how do we resist, right? And so hearing some of the things that you were saying, like there seemed to be, whether it's looking at, I think Eric Davis, maybe 5 or 6 years ago, was sort of posing this question of, you know, who controls the future, who gets to decide what meaning gets made around this space. As a similarly, as a self-identified degenerate who doesn't have the political or the scholastic cred of the doctors on the team.
Dave's our managing editor, by the way.
Yeah, well, but that was the thing when I had the opportunity to sort of have any sort of spotlight in psychedelic spaces, I was so pissed off at the lack of political analysis and broader social discourse in the space that it was like, cool, I'm just going to unapologetically put down these ideas. You know, I had done some sort of ethnobotanical analysis type stuff that gave me enough cred that if people were going to say, who are you? I could say, well, I'm the guy who's contributed to these efforts. If you don't want to hear my socio-political views, that's fine, but I'm certainly not going to back away from them. So hearing some of your own comments and seeing that alignment between the psychedelic and the personal and the political and sort of, you know, there were things there that were very resonant for me.
I think that with psychedelics, something that bothers me, and this might be my most controversial opinion of this discussion. You might hang up the call after I say this, but one of the things that kind of bugs me is this idea that they must be used productively. Like they must be used either, like I said in that video, tech bros microdosing so that they can convert more calories into JavaScript, or you can use it for the legitimate purpose of healing, but like anyone who wants to eat a gram of mushrooms and just sit under a tree and look at the sky, that's a waste of time, and that's like an irresponsible use of these substances. And I find that very troubling as a concept, that just to take a drug simply because you enjoy it is not enough. And to say that enjoying something, it kind of implies that like the pursuit of pleasure is a waste of time.
Oh, you're in good company here.
Yeah. Okay.
Well, that kind of dovetails into how I got into like the work with Psymposia too. Is I'm also lacking a PhD, by the way, so you're in company here. But I went to school for journalism, and kind of as I was getting out, knew I wanted to write about psychedelics, and all this stuff was kind of coming up on the horizon. There was all this energy building around it, and I kind of jumped in as a cheerleader a little bit. Luckily got hooked up with Psymposia, who had some wonderful like critical opinions in the space, and
took away your optimism.
We're recovering.
Yeah, took away my optimism. No, I still have optimism. In particular towards what you just said. I don't think it has to be taken productively, and I think like there's all this kind of creative energy that can be put towards that, or just doing it for fun, whatever. And I think that's what kind of, when my eyes opened, was doing some reporting on all of this. Seeing like that some of the major organizations in this space weren't necessarily shooting for full decriminalization, or like they were just trying to reschedule so that they could use it in a medical setting. And there are all these kind of nuances to what's happening in the space. And then getting into covering Compass, which I'm sure we'll talk about later, and all the Corporadelia stuff that's happening.
It's just like, it's baffling to me in Canada that like we legalized cannabis and nothing happened. Like everything is fine. And you would think then that the same story wouldn't work about psychedelics. Like the same story that they told about cannabis for decades. And then we legalized it and none of it was true. You'd think then people would be more skeptical of that story to other drugs, but it just, I don't know.
Well, there's a really fascinating sort of internalization of prohibitionist logic, even among researchers, like psychedelic researchers, right? Where it's like, if we look at medicalization, the premise of medicalization is a prohibitionist logic. It's a prohibition light stance of like,
Yes.
okay, even though drugs weren't criminalized according to any scientific or evidentiary basis, we have the legitimate credentials to engage with them. And it's like, you've already ceded territory that shouldn't have been, right? And
It's
so then,
literally an authoritarian stance.
Yes.
yeah.
It's
So
like actually the onus is on you to explain why it's justified that this is, illegal in the first place. It's like there's not actually justification for that like enclosure of the commons.
It is wild to me that anyone accepts the idea of any law being arbitrary, right?
Totally.
Like if this isn't grounded in something real, then like why are we just letting them tell us that that's illegal? Like it's wild.
Well,
and
particularly
in that case
because of the
too,
history of its prohibition in the first place, because we now know how explicit it was, the drug war generally, but psychedelics in particular, used to target political opponents, entire demographics of, racialized people. Dave, you're going to say something.
Yeah, I think looking at that should also, for reasonably open people, particularly psychedelic enthusiasts, it also points towards problems with psychedelic exceptionalism, right? The notion that psychedelics are good drugs, hard drugs should remain criminalized. Like if you look back at the Ehrlichman quote, you're talking about cannabis for hippies and heroin for Black communities. And the notion that like by criminalizing heroin, it gives you an opportunity to disrupt these communities engaged in political action and organization that you don't want to see. And so it's like, well, hold on, whether we're talking about heroin or psilocybin containing mushrooms, like at the sort of foundation of this, we have a completely illegitimate intervention on behalf of the state. And so just on that alone, like it's like going back to a talk I gave in 2015, like rather than psychedelic or drug enthusiasts saying like, oh, we're not criminals, there's no basis for criminalization, so therefore we reject that label on a moral grounds. It's like, no, you are criminals, acknowledge that, own that, and look at what that tells you about the socio-political system that you're locked into.
Those people don't speak for me. I'm proud to say I'm a criminal.
Dave and I have been pushing that in comments in recent sort of shall we say discussions, but I mean I've led like talks with that, and sort of you do a bio on who you are, and it's like I've been taking psychedelics for 25 years. Of course I'm a criminal, and I say that look, I recognize that psychedelics are much less criminalized, much less prosecuted, much less hounded than crack cocaine, obviously, and yet like owning the narrative is both like factually correct and is a bit of a solidarity statement. I wanted to point though to something, Nishay, you said earlier about like enclosing the commons. And one of the things why I think these like leftist perspectives are both needed in psychedelia, and I would even argue particularly because of what Matt just said about pleasure, the politics of pleasure. Psychedelics are needed in leftist spaces as well. What happens when we win? What are we going to do all day, right? I mean, probably not psychedelics every day, but a couple of months in the days of the month isn't so bad, But like right now, that enclosure movement, a modern enclosure movement, is being led by corporations, and so we often use this term corporadelic. So like, manifesting corporations,
which just makes them sound so much cooler than they are. I understand that it's a term meant to be like menacing, like and show how phony it is, but it does give this little like that's still a cool suffix. Like,
well, how do you feel about profidelic?
Yeah,
or corporate.
That's even cooler because I think PROPHET.
Ah, see,
there's a lot of people making spin-offs of the corporadelic right now.
I'm just thinking how cool it would be to do drugs with Ronald McDonald and hang out with Grimace. Like, that would be tight. Yeah. Sorry.
No,
sorry. It's going to be a lot of you guys saying profound things that consider a lot of sociological angles, and then me talking about Grimace boners and shit. Like that's what I'm going to bring to this discussion.
Well, I'm pretty sure I mean, is he like a bruised or moldy chicken McNugget? Like, what is Grimace?
He is a drop of milkshake.
Oh, okay. I didn't know that. That's great.
Purple? when did they have?
Well, this is the part, obviously, of every discussion where I have to go into the history of the Grimace.
Yes.
Originally, he was a 6-armed monster, which is why it's called Grimace. Like, it's an angry word, right? That was green, and he represented the Shamrock Shake, and he would go around and steal people's Shamrock Shakes, and then gradually the character became a good guy, and so the inverse of green is purple, and that's how we got the lovable creature that we have now.
So I mean,
I had no idea the Shamrock Shake had been around that long.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, or even like, what is the McDonald's fixation on characters who want to steal your food that you're purchasing from them, whether it's Grimace or Hamburglar or yeah.
It's a manifestation of the carceral state. They think that everybody's out to get everyone else. You know, if you don't protect your food, it's get a gun.
Good shit. So, I mean, just on the Corporadelia kick for a moment, it feels worth noting that it's actually popped up in a few more corporate outlets, although they haven't yet spelled it correctly. We've had some amusing. I don't.
You think
know.
that's on purpose? I like wonder that every time I see it misspelled.
Yeah, I just don't think people care. But like looking at
it's also not a real word. Like, to be fair,
like all words are made up.
Any words. But I guess like thinking about some of the rise of these logics and so for us, well, maybe I'll just speak for myself. So for me, like when I saw some of the corporations beginning some of their more public incursions, you know, coming from an anarchist background, there wasn't a need to sort of wait and see what was going to happen. Like we've got, you know, centuries of history that show how this all plays out, how it's played out in a variety of different fields, contexts, settings, whatever. And yet what I found is when starting to raise pretty straightforward critiques of like how things work in a material sense and how capitalism sort of engages in recuperation. And I mean, you know, and this is also not unique for psychedelics. Like you've got Doug Rushkoff and people who have given these critiques, you know, in decades past. And yet the number of people in the space who seemed very intent on saying, oh, no, let's wait and see, you know, psychedelic entrepreneurship, psychedelic corporations have a chance to be different. And Jeff Bathji, sort of a colleague.
He's a therapist.
Yeah, has pointed out that like, you know, the Christian, literally Christianity couldn't withstand the forces of capitalism. Do you really think that somehow psychedelics present a greater power? And yet here we are sort of 2-3 years, I guess 3 years after Compass Pathways really came on the scene hot around sort of raising questions about patents, commodification, the rest of it, where so many people had insisted that they weren't going to do it and that we or I should shut up and stop making problems and just go along, get along.
It's a sign of progress that these corporations are coming in. Like, look how, you know, psychedelics becoming part of the mainstream means that we've won, you know.
Mainstreaming is good, actually.
Yeah.
Well, and now seeing that as they're trying to patent psilocybin for, you know, pretty much any mental health condition you might be able to name, suddenly there's outcry, and it's like, well, what can we do about it? And trying to explain to people, well, you kind of got to catch these things on the front end.
Matt, you were about to say something.
I think I understand. Like, I think they make a really good pitch to people. Like the idea is that because they have all of this power institutionally and they have all of this marketing apparatuses and shit, that if we simply let them make their money, then what they will do in return is mainstream this so that it no longer seems dangerous, and then this greater shift can occur that makes it easier to legalize or easier to decriminalize or whatever. But I think the devil's bargain of that is that that's not really what they want. Right. Like they get a better deal, like they get more money out of it through the medicalized route. Like, because if you just legalized psychedelics tomorrow, everybody could just grow them. Like you can, it's the simplest thing in the world. Like, you need a tub in a closet and you can do it. Like so yeah, I think that's.
Well, that's one of the things that we we try and advocate for decriminalization, mainly because like there's already an apparatus for this distribution of all drugs that's effective enough that it actually gets into prisons, and so if you'd like to, like, I guess, I don't know, maybe I'm being pedantic here, but like there's a big difference between the process of destigmatization, decriminalization, mainstreaming, and legalization. And they deal with like culture and state repression and hearts and minds. I didn't mean to talk over you, Russ. What were you going to say?
No, I agree. Sorry. I thought you were.
Oh, no, you're good. I was just going to say, to your point, Matt, that there's some of the biggest investors in the space right now. One of them in particular is keen on saying he's like pro decriminalization, but completely anti-recreational use. So like, what does that mean? And why would anyone who's looking to him for like guidance in a mainstream way, like come away from talking to him thinking that decrim is the best option?
I've grown to hate the term recreational use. I've grown to hate this term because what is that
party use, by the way?
Yeah, that's always how you can tell you're the good guy in the story, when you're against partying. These teens with their music. No, you should use psychedelics to sit in a dark room and think about how you're going to work hard tomorrow.
Yeah.
Like that's
optimize your output.
Yeah. But to your point, Brian, I agree that all of those things are very different. I guess what I was trying to say is that I think that people view them as a straight line of progress, like an inevitable chain of dominoes, as though like, if we simply let them run amok, those naive fools, they don't know, the dominoes will fall in place, when in reality, like, no, they're controlling us, not the other way around. Like they're very carefully managing what they're doing.
Well, and that presents some of, what I've called like the dose the water 2.0 logic, where when we look at sort of medicalization and mainstreaming, there's this less than critically examined notion that if we can just get this stuff into every therapist's office, right? We're no longer looking at municipal water supplies. Now it's quick, get it into the therapist's office. And then when enough people go see their therapists for psychedelic assisted psychotherapy, then the world changes. And when you sort of start interrogating the hows and whys and what are the systemic and structural realities around that, and you start asking the people who are pushing for that for explanations of the mechanisms, you get a bunch of frustrated, upset people saying, well, stop asking me those questions. I don't really know what you want me to say.
When you have these expansive experiences, like many of which might give you some insight into the systemic factors that are, aspects of your experience are connected to, or, societal problems that are not just about individualistic solutions. So you can gain insight into those systems from these non-ordinary states of consciousness that get you outside your normal individual perspective. But if you're doing that in this, homogenous medicalization, like, context where your therapist is trained to every kind of intense experience you have, say, and how is this about your childhood? How is this able to make your work week more productive and more efficient? That's going to affect the kinds of insights that people are walking out of the room with. And so that's part of why we're really interested in pushing back against this cookie cutter standardized medical approach, because it's actively influencing sort of the kinds of the context within which people are having these experiences, which, makes them more amenable to furthering the status quo, as opposed to being used as tools to dismantle the status quo.
I think it's interesting that the type of people who are kind of taking charge in this process have these like really regimented ideas, like we were talking about recreational or party use versus medical use versus, for profit or whatever. But the like anyone who's taken psychedelics knows that like they blend boundaries, and it's really hard to have very strict ideas about things when you're on psychedelics. And I just find that to be a very interesting irony, that you're taking something that complicates issues and trying to simplify it by force.
Totally. So one of the things that Nishay was alluding to is this, the plan that's being built here of medicalization, of managed boundary dissolution. It's isolating. You're literally outnumbered in the method that's being proposed. 2 therapists in the room with you, and you're certainly not tripping with anybody you know, or really anybody else.
Russ, do you have that picture that you made with the one with
it's
the
fantastic.
mask? It really speaks to the kind of isolation.
Yeah, I'll see if I can upload it to Zoom, and I'll just make it my
that'd be great.
Sorry to interrupt, but
no, it's super relevant. But I don't know. So there's been a lot of talk about social change and and science fiction, which dystopia are we in, and lately people have been it's not Orwell anymore, it's much more likely Aldous Huxley. But I've said it recently, I guess, that I think Philip K. Dick may have had the right one, just awful corporations indebting everybody, and yet we've got reality distorting
here we go.
Drugs at our fingertips, anyhow.
So that's the picture.
Beautiful.
This from Field Trip, right? Or Russ made it into a cool kaleidoscope art thing, but the actual images are Field Trip's trip process for in COVID. So
well,
you have the mask.
I feel like since about January, this image of right here, the mask with the mask with the headphones has been circulating in all these media pieces, and it just creeps me out.
Yeah.
Have you ever heard of the artist David Dees?
No.
I don't think so.
He's this extremely anti-Semitic political cartoonist.
Is he Stone Toss?
Okay. No, he's not Stone Toss. He does all of his stuff in Photoshop. If you saw one of his images, you probably they spread around, but he died recently. But all of his images are about this conspiratorial mindset that he has. He was a deeply mentally ill man, but it looks like that. This looks like a work that he would do about the government injecting microchips into people. But it's real. It's just what they're doing. Yeah.
Just when you think about the full range of possibility with psychedelics, and what you can get out of being with some close friends out in the woods, able to move around and just be in your body and play, it opens up a lot of different types of experience compared to when you're in a chair like that, strapped in, and every time you try to move, you have people telling you, oh, put the mask back on, pull the eye shades back on, put the headphones back on. And it just is a really restrictive thing to try to make the standard version of accessing these types of experiences. If that's the kind of game you want to play, sure, go for it, but to try to force that as the only legal means of accessing the experiences seems really extreme to me.
Yeah, I mean, I don't know, my experiences with psychedelics are that I often do things rearrange the room and turn the furniture upside down and wear ridiculous clothing combinations or whatever, and I like it. Okay, it's a good way to change one's perspective and perhaps make some art, but I don't know how allowed that is in a much more managed setting.
Well, and if you compare, sorry, go ahead, Matt.
Well, I was just going to say, I think that this is the way that a corporation views harm reduction, because we would look at it the idea is to keep the person from doing something that harms themselves. They look at it as, we need to protect ourselves from liability if this person gets hurt. Mm-hmm. So we'll just strap them to a chair and close their eyes and blast Beethoven's Fifth into their, literally the Ludovico technique is basically what they're suggesting for psychedelic therapy. Because if they just let people walk around and do the things you want to do when you're on psychedelics, then they might walk into the street and get hit by a car. I mean, so
they might take
and then they'll sue
off.
us. Yeah.
Yeah, and I mean, thinking too about some of the norms, or the considering that this is all taking place in the context of like dominant medical systems, right? That you deal with how well or how ill-equipped really some of these folks are for dealing with populations that they're not familiar with. So there's been like ongoing internal criticisms from psychedelic researchers of color about the degree to which some of these studies are, do not generalize to non-white populations. And, one of our advisors, Jay Sevelius, who's a psychedelic researcher himself, was telling us about, one of the female therapists of color who was like finishing up a session, and the supervising or whatever, the attending therapist basically said something to the effect of, well, now can't you see why all lives matter? And
this
like,
person was coming out of an MDMA session herself.
Yeah. And so like, so knowing that some of this shit is going on in these spaces, right? It's not even just sort of the material necessities to like, how can we minimize like physical harm or unwanted fallout or whatever. It's like, it brings all the blind spots of sort of neoliberal psychotherapy and the notion of, well, how can we adjust the individual to fit the society rather than addressing like the core causes of these illnesses as sort of mediated by society, which is the inverse of why these therapists are saying they're so excited about psychedelics, right? That on a personal level, it approaches something curative. And so, yeah, systemic symptom management seems like a hellish limbo for these things to exist in.
So I have a quick question for Matt. Matt, I caught your live stream, whatever the last one was, and
yesterday?
You were going yesterday. I guess that was yesterday. Was that really yesterday?
No, sorry,
Saturday.
The days
Thursday.
Okay,
Yeah.
Thank you, because you were just messing with my
sorry,
time there.
Sorry.
But you played that video with Jordan Peterson, Ben Shapiro, and Dave Rubin, and they were talking about psychedelics.
That was to prepare for this, by the way.
Fantastic.
I knew I had to watch that video before I sat down to this conversation.
He
wonderful.
messaged it to us and said, I think that's I was preparing.
Yeah. So it's good stuff, because I've thought a lot about, the right and like right-wing psychedelia, and not just like people trying to make money, but like actual Nazis and the intellectual dark web. And like I'd seen that clip, but like you sort of taking me through it again, I noticed something that I hadn't noticed before. First of all, I had not registered that Dave Rubin, it seems like he's taken a lot of psychedelics, and so he's not really much improved. But you'd asked if you sort of mused about whether or not Jordan Peterson had taken psychedelics. He's admitted to have taken psilocybin in a couple of venues. I think it was on Duncan Trussell. He talked about it.
Well, first of all, I'm very disappointed to find out that he was on Duncan Trussell's podcast.
Yeah, I know,
literally just had that same thought. I was like, wait, I didn't know that.
But I find that really difficult to believe, to be honest. I find, because the way that he talks about them, and it seems like received wisdom. It doesn't, he talks about them in the sense of like, here's what they do. And like, no, it's anyone who has taken psychedelics cannot articulate what they do so concretely. It's I find it a mind like his that is so black and white. Like literally, he bases his worldview on the idea of order versus chaos.
Right.
In this like. And furthermore, that order is good and chaos is bad, which you'll say, oh, I don't believe that. I don't believe that chaos is bad. And then he writes a book and calls it The Antidote to Chaos. Like,
right.
Well, it's just
because we need
precision.
antidotes for things that we love,
When he was talking on Tim Ferriss, right? I didn't watch the Tim Ferriss interview,
Yeah.
but it came out recently, something about like beware of unearned wisdom.
Yeah, he was quoting Jung.
some cautionary take on it.
Right. So I guess I was going to talk about this later, but it's pretty relevant right now in the sense that, like, so he quotes Jung, and he says, you know, beware of unearned wisdom, and it's pretty funny that you sort of read him as somebody regurgitating received wisdom. But you know, Tim Ferriss was retweeted by Dr. Robin Carhart Harris, and like I found that upsetting. I teach a psychedelic studies course, and I teach some of his papers. Like, for those who don't know, he's at Johns Hopkins and has done a lot of.
No.
I'm sorry. Imperial College.
Imperial.
Right. Yeah, he's a Brit. He was at Imperial College, and he does a number of things. But he's published like functional magnetic resonance images of people on psilocybin. So he's made like real interesting contributions. And then here he is like retweeting Jordan Peterson, who's like a crank and a right-wing crank and a transphobic crank. We wouldn't even know who he is if it wasn't for that. Free speech, like transphobia that he ginned up. So I wrote a thread about it, and then a bunch of neuroscientists all over the world were like mad at me and calling me like a cancel culture person,
a puritanical troll.
There you go. Yeah. But
I've
just
done that a couple times recently.
Well, first of all, I'll just say anything we say about Jordan Peterson, we are taking him out of context, and that's not what he meant.
Well, he did
just get that out of the way.
To the call.
That's what all of your comments will be on this. So I just wanted to get that out of the way.
Thank you.
So that they know that we know. Yeah.
And Robin, I just think it's related, so I don't want to get too far away from the topic, but just also recently banned Dave for trying to raise a conversation, I thought quite politely, around
the first time
capitalism.
It was polite. Yeah,
the second one was a meme.
Well, so hang on. Initially, what happened is Robin was sharing. He's got a new app called My Delica, and in general, I'm kind of skeptical and concerned by the incursion of surveillance capitalism into psychedelia more generally. I won't say anything about your Fitbit, Matt, other than that. Sorry.
Well, I'll tell you the reason I have this Fitbit is because I have a lot of anxiety about my heart rate. And I often worry that I'm going to have a heart attack.
Yeah,
totally.
So it's very helpful for me to have this Fitbit and go, no, I have a normal heart rate right now. Yeah. I'm just having anxiety.
And I'm all for that. I just wish we lived in a world where if that technology was to exist, it was a closed system where you had that, you could have access to that, and it would not potentially get beamed or used by, insurers and corporations and all the fun folks out there.
I mean, I guess technically I could take my own pulse, but in a sense,
it's just not so
the universe has given us that technology.
But so, I pointed out that some years ago, Robin had come to a talk that I'd given on ayahuasca phytochemistry and had sort of thanked me, and we'd had some really productive conversation afterwards. And I said, hey, like, I think this presents another opportunity for dialogue around what's going on here. And I got silence. So, maybe a week later, I posted a meme. It's the guy sneaking up behind the other guy and hitting him over the head with the pole. And it was labeled Corporadelia firms, surveillance capitalism, and the psychedelic community, indicating that we're about to get bludgeoned with surveillance capitalism.
Is the meme what caused him to block you?
Yes, the meme. So he blocked me after I shared the meme. People decried it. Well, they didn't really decry it as trolling. They actually blamed Pace for being a prior troll.
The well. Yeah.
And that because he brought up Jordan Peterson and tried to make an issue that had somehow soured Robin to engage. So we wind up with this sort of like, as whether it's for offering radical critiques or leftist perspectives, there's this notion that we are whiny or screechy, or that like, you guys do really great analysis of the corporations, but when you get into this cancel culture stuff, we just don't want to listen to you, so go away.
No, that's the thing is like we are like as a rule, we're actually quite disciplined online and in general. Like when dealing with anybody that we disagree with ideologically, we're unfailingly quite polite.
Yeah, me too. Yeah.
Wait, but I do want to come back to your video real quick because you caused me to notice something. Aside from Dave Rubin, probably is eating more Molly than any of us, you know. But like, you know, Ben Shapiro was being asked by Dave Rubin, and you know he's feeling probably all friendly there, being with Daddy Peterson as well. But like, you know, Dave Rubin was like, well, you know, you haven't had these experiences, but like, you know, surely even you can admit that they could be useful. And Ben Shapiro tacitly admitted that he actually supports a medical model for psychedelics. He said, well, if under the influence, you know, somebody had a trained professional with them, like I could get behind that. And I thought that was really telling, you know, because so many authoritarians' morality is like based on what the laws are, you know, and that's and so as psychedelic mainstreaming happens, as corporations get into the game, it's not going to change the world. It's not going to change people's minds. It's just going to give people who previously didn't allow themselves the pleasure to do it, which I mean, okay, cool.
Well,
I would say on top of that.
Yeah, go.
Sorry, just real. This is a quick
please.
point.
Yeah,
but
please.
That not simply that it's a legality issue. It's the idea that if you have a professional there, you have a figure of authority that can tell you how you are to interpret the experience, what you are to do with it, how it's meant to affect your life. You can't do it on your own. It can't be an unmediated experience.
Which is valid, which is not. You know, let's sort it out. Yeah.
Yeah, and those authoritarian tendencies, I mean, that goes back, you know, we can see it in MK Ultra and some of the experimentation that was going on there. We see it in a bunch of, it actually exists in quite a few veins of psychedelic therapy that are very much still alive and well, but there's you know, none of this is new, right? Like if we go back and we look at Albert Hoffman's buddy, Ernst Jünger, you know, we see that, and this is something, you know, I know we wanted to talk about psychedelic Nazis and Lucy in the Sky and all that fun stuff. And so, you know, tracing it back decades, you wind up with people who, okay, fine, he disavowed the party in 1938 or whatever, but he was effectively, I mean, he was a German military general
This
at
is
the
Jünger.
point where this is Jünger, yeah, where the Nazis are rolling through Europe, right? So Nazi enough.
Well, so here's the thing about Jünger. And so I wrote a piece, I guess I've written 3 pieces now about like psychedelic Nazis and right wingers. One of them well, 2 of them recently, because one of them was about Jake and Jelly and then some other stuff. But like Jünger came up in the first one and was, you know, drawing upon the work of another scholar named Alan Piper, who does some really great stuff. But like Ernst Jünger was a censor for the Nazis. He was not a party member. They offered him like a position in the Reichstag or something, but he supported Hitler and the Nazi Party up until the night of the long knives, Kristallnacht.
Up until there was consequences for Nazis.
Right. Like, so he was pretty far into the shit, you know. And then regardless, he didn't like flee the country. He served in the Nazi army as a censor for the Reich in occupied France. Okay, so that's Jünger. However, Jünger coined the term psychonaut. Like he coined the term.
Fun times.
Albert Hoffman devotes an entire chapter of his LSD My Problem Child to Jünger, calling it the radiance of Jünger, and like went to Jünger as like his go-to tripping buddy guide. So this is like right at the foundation of psychedelics.
You are letting the air out of me right now.
It's what we do. We can't help it.
So, you know, like, here's the thing. Like, the idea is like in pop culture, there's this like, oh, well, psychedelics and hippies, they're inextricably linked, but like, it's a pretty that's a pretty like just scratching the surface read of things. You know, you dig a little deeper and then you're like, oh shit, it looks like in the United States it was the CIA who was, you know, doing the most dosing first, you know. And then you're like, okay, it wasn't the CIA, it was like people like, you know, mucky mucks. Like Gordon Wasson was a JP Morgan banker, and he was like tripping with the publishers of fucking Life magazine. Claire Luce like went on to be a virulent anti-communist and like ambassador to Italy in the 50s Cold War. Like these substances do not turn you into like a squishy bleeding heart liberal. They just don't.
Well, and this is
there's a lot of like narrative around that, like as part of the justification for mainstreaming and medicalization, that this will dose the water 2.0, you know, get it out there, and that will just turn people more empathetic and like more concerned with people who are different from them. And it doesn't necessarily go that direction.
No, I mean, and yet, you know, give it 2 months and we'll see another article, you know, can psychedelics heal the world?
Well,
so.
and I think there's a piece, sorry, Matt, did you want to?
Well, just one thing, I remember a few years ago, and one of the reasons I make so many videos about psychedelics is because I remember long before I knew about any leftist YouTubers or anything like that, and I was just looking for trip reports online. One of the guys that I found was a guy named Sticks and Hammer 666. If you're familiar with this particular Nazi, no. His name should give you an idea of him, but he's got like long metalhead hair, big circular John Lennon glasses, and he never wears a shirt. And he's very thin.
He has a Hitler mustache, and he has like a 27-minute video on why women won't date him while there's like a Nazi flag behind him.
No, the exact title is "Women Won't Date Me Because of Feminism."
There we go. I know who we're talking about now. Yeah.
But I remember I was watching him, and I just got a bad vibe. I didn't know who he was, but I'm like, something about this guy gives me a bad vibe. And he kept using the term entheogen. Like, oh, these are the entheogens I've taken. And I'm like,
we were just talking about.
We were just talking about that word, yeah.
Like, you really feel like you use these substances and like got in touch with the divine and came back like still this like racist piece of shit. Like it just, yeah, it nothing shatters the illusion quite like that.
Yeah. I mean,
well, sorry, go ahead.
Real quick, Nazis are anti-intellectual, and they're actually pretty mystical. So
syncretic. They're syncretic. Yeah. They'll take whatever suits their agenda and just mash it in.
You got it. Okay.
Yeah, and it's an effective way.
Oh, wonderful.
For building that mythos. Which we've also seen like with Q and whether it's Jake Angeli or I'm spacing on the other guy who was at the Capitol.
Oh, William Watson.
Yeah.
You know that picture of the two, you know, the Q shaman and the guy that looks like a wook, like both of them are way into psychedelics. And so, yeah, we wrote about those. Dave, what you're going to say?
Yeah, well, so I think there's this conflation. I don't think it's intentional. I think a lot of the people just haven't given it much thought. But like, there's like, I don't think that psychedelics are going to make people progressive or radical or give analysis. And at the same time, I think psychedelic experiences are by and large inherently political. Like, I think that they present political tensions, right? Like if you have a connection with everything, if you feel that all there is love, and you come back to a capitalist society that's predicated on hundreds of billions in ads telling you that you're unlovable, there is political work to be done around that. Or if you have what the researchers call a nature connectedness type experience, you know, and you come back with some notion of ecological integrity or the significance therein, like you can wind up, you know, with an eco-feminist perspective or a deep ecological perspective or an eco-fascist perspective. And, you know, just because there's a political tension there doesn't mean that there's a necessary outcome as far as the resolution. It becomes, again, about what work are you doing in the real world? How is that analysis applied? What do you do with it? And that was actually something that, again, looking back at that early psychedelic video when I think Nishay shared it, where it was like, oh, cool, like somebody else who's willing to talk about some of those political tensions and the way that like they should inform the way that we engage. And I mean, to your point earlier, Matt, about like the dividing lines, like, I can think about plenty of experiences I've had that have been like recreational, therapeutic, political, that sort of like over the course of the experience, it touches on a little bit of all of that. And then at the end of the day, you get to sit with the fallout and figure out, cool, what do I do about this in my own life?
I have a question for Matt, actually, that might help contextualize some of this. I mean, so without getting too specific, because I know that gets tricky, like, were you into your political journey before your psychedelic journey, or vice versa?
Vice versa.
Yeah.
Well, are any of you cops? Because if you are, you have to tell me.
Yeah, that's the law.
That's the law.
Yeah.
No, I mean, like, so, and I guess this is the point where I mentioned this, is that like, I'm the type of person where, and I don't, there's a couple of neurological conditions that might be the basis for this, but I'm not trying to self-diagnose, but I hyperfixate on things. And so the bulk of my psychedelic experiences took place in my mid-20s. Now I'm in my mid-30s, and it's harder to carve out time to trip, especially because my wife's not a big fan of the idea. But but now psychedelics are very much my hyperfixation. So it has been something that really the bulk of my learning about it has been over the past like year or so.
Well, if you ever want any, we are all like super, super hyperfixated nerds about psychedelics. That's like literally.
And how?
Yeah, like we've been around like the space for, well, like Dave and I mean, some of us for 10 over 10 years.
In the public space, yeah.
So like when I say like the psychedelic space, I mean like the conference like landscape, where, because what happened like basically 10 years ago was that psychedelic conferences started popping up, which served kind of like a bat signal in the sky for psychonauts. And now that word is now not there, but nonetheless, like not just people who were interested in medicalization, but who were psychedelic people who were like, oh wow, there's a place I can actually go to hang with other people that find this thing that a lot of people think is bad, really interesting. And so it's like but within that space, there's very few leftists, and there's very few, it's like we are the vast minority, like in that space. And so
it's pretty libertarian dominant, wouldn't you say?
Yeah,
Michelle?
a lot
that's
of
a good point.
Libertarian in the sense of the like,
American
conservative. Like,
Yes, my audience will eat me alive if I don't mention that libertarian is a stolen word.
Right.
Yep.
That's why I said that. Yeah.
Is there a better word for them? Like, is it just doo-doo heads, or like what is it?
I think you got it in one.
Yeah, actually, I heard a psychedelic historian refer to Ayn Rand as an anarcho-capitalist, and I have on my to-do list to reach out to him and say, hey, Christian, we have to have a conversation about that and why that's not a thing, because
it's a thing. It's a thing, but it's a term.
Not. Yes, but it's intellectually incoherent, oxymoronic, and otherwise.
Yeah,
those are all
confused.
things.
Yeah,
it is a thing, but it is not what it thinks it is.
Right. Well, and just to throw out around the conferences, like, Nishay put on an event at the University of Pennsylvania back in 2012 that I think was a huge inflection point. Yeah. And
well, it was back then, it was sort of like, it was so small still, the community, that there was this sense of like, we're all in it together. And some of the like scientists were there and happy to hang out with Burning Man artists. And there was like a lot of just general like on-sidedness in terms of the feel around it. Like, but as things have progressed in terms of the mainstreaming, the tensions that were always there between different priorities and goals really started bubbling to the surface, that we're not actually all on the same team. We don't have the same goals in mind that we're working towards. And so, yeah, so we're just really hoping to be able to serve as like a little like leftist like rallying thing, like in order to help connect that psychedelic conference space to the left community that so far hasn't been super connected to that realm.
You did a tweet, like, I don't know, probably a couple of months back, Matt. It was just like, it was something that like really resonated, and we were like, we need to reach out to Thoughtsline like immediately. It was like something like, it's really crappy that the only place that you can find psychedelics on YouTube is like Sam Harris, Joe Rogan, and like Jordan Peterson.
Yeah.
And that's very much like what we're trying to do, is to try and produce counter narratives that are both more hopeful, but also like rigorous and grounded, because right now there is a huge incursion of capital into the psychedelic space. And this is one of the reasons why we're trying to be a bat signal to the broader left movement, to be like, hey, actually, this is a super teachable moment. Like, capital calls psychedelics a virgin market. This is an incredible case study. There aren't that many untapped markets these days. So what happens? What do they do? What's the first thing they do?
Well, and also on top of that, like, it feels worth pointing out that, I mean, one, like when we talk about the psychedelic community or the space or whatever, and we talk, like, I mean, it's a space that I avoided for many years, you know, sort of popping up once or twice a year because I couldn't, I had no interest in it. Most of it was boring. The sort of the political analysis, the social analysis was garbage. It was a sense of like, why would I want to participate in that? And then seeing the need for sort of interventions, like if these are the spaces in which some of this discourse is taking place, there's a need to throw down around that. But if you think back to leftist spaces, like, you know, I ran with a bunch of the OG crime think people for a while with,
Oh, really?
you know, I organized with Earth First, things like that, where like in those spaces, you can find tons of people who have psychedelic experience, but they're not talking about it because it's a fucking risk. You know, it's, you're not going to be out there, you know, on your forest blockade saying, oh yeah, remember that time we did mushrooms together, not knowing like, you know, how many informants are. Right, exactly. I mean, similarly around Occupy, right? When you had infiltrators, when you had, you know, concerns. I mean, I remember meeting a bunch of new people, and psychedelics are something I fixated on for many years. So these were things where I was interested in talking with new people about those things. And also for some folks, you could see how sketched out it made them. And until we developed trust and relationship, that was a very real thing. So when you talk about Harris and Rogan, like these are sort of figureheads that can talk about this in ways in arenas where you don't have those same realities.
They're super comfortable. I mean, they're very, you know, rich, well-positioned, you know, white men. Of course, they can talk about their float tanks and smoking DMT every second.
And my concern is that when that is all that there is, when you Google psychedelics, and that's like what pops up on YouTube or whatever, it's really off-putting for people who are not in that culture. You know, it's like, you don't want to be part of the psychedelic scene if that's what that means, you know. So part of what we're trying to do is just have like a little offshoot tent for the weirdos to come hang out, and, you know, just make it clear that you don't need to be into like MMA, or, you know, nothing against MMA, but just, you know, you don't have to be a specific kind of way to be interested in these subjects.
I think that also it's like, when like it's bizarre to me that these subjects don't kind of overlap more, specifically in terms, I come from an anarchist perspective. It's like the fact that there is this unjust law that like the state imposes on you for its own reasons, like it doesn't benefit you, is such a good talking point to demonstrate like how dangerous the state apparatus is, right? Like that if you can go to jail and just be incarcerated and have your life fucking flushed down the toilet and ruined because you grew the wrong type of mushroom in your backyard. Like
yeah.
You would think that would be such an easy talking point, but but because there's that stigma, people don't want to use that because then it's like competing legitimizations. Like, oh, I want to be legitimized as a leftist, and I also want to be legitimized as a psychonaut. Can't say the word now without. By the way, has anyone coined the term psycho-Nazi?
Oh God, you just did. Fucking A.
Yeah.
Well done.
That's good.
Damn. All right, writing that one down.
That has to go
Yeah.
in the next.
Yeah, that's
right.
happening.
Matt, to
It's
your
all
point,
yours.
there's a real stumbling block too when you consider the inadequacy or the lack of development of certain straight edge critiques, right? Because you wind up like I was in a number of very straight edge places, communities, like, or at least straight edge folks made up significant subsections of those spaces and communities, and like they weren't necessarily hostile towards, you know, psychedelics per se, but even getting past the threshold of like credibility there, that there might be some merit there, and trying to talk to them about like what is the concern about substance use. Like, let's talk about, you know, if human beings are in some ways biochemical creatures, then like where are we drawing the line around distinction, which also goes to your earlier point around medicalization and the notion that, yeah, you can take drugs to heal, but at a certain point you have restored your sort of fixed functional whole, and if you continue to indulge in drug use past that point, well, that's unacceptable drug use, because now it's like improvement, or it's alteration, or it's not restoration.
Yeah,
I wanted to. Oh, go on.
Well, it's like if people get into this with like comparing drugs to one another, and the one they always rest on is alcohol. They always say, look, if you want a dangerous drug, alcohol is the most dangerous. But I come from it from a perspective of bodily autonomy. Totally. Like, you know, fucking, I drink. So like, yeah, alcohol is the most dangerous, and I drink. So like, it's there's no legitimate function for it. It's just because I like the way it feels.
Totally.
And the fact that like,
well, that is legitimate.
Yeah, it is, right? But like the idea that that is presented as like a failing of our culture, that in a sensible world, the government would apply this this prohibition to alcohol instead of psychedelics.
That works well.
I'm of the opinion, I'm of the opinion that no, even if a drug is nothing but dangerous, prohibition itself is a problem, because all that does is make it more dangerous to use.
And I wanted to speak to what you were saying. It's a perfect. I think it's perfect. No, to what you were saying about extending to cognitive liberty, right? Like, so the idea, you know, okay, whether it is through ideological, you know, hegemony with the straight edge community, or through, you know, some kind of imposition like prohibition in general, what we're looking at from a cognitive liberty perspective is a kind of mind control by the reduction of options, you know? So, you know, Terence McKenna often would throw out references to like, well, the drugs that are allowed are the ones that, you know, help you conform to a 40-hour work week. What a beautiful time back when it was 40 hours a week, you know? But like, you know, it's true. SSRIs, even medicalized, you know, supervised, you know, dextroamphetamine, you know, Adderall kind of stuff, like that's all fine as long as you show up to work. But you know, ultimately they're constraining the options of what we can think and feel. And when you look at the rhetoric of power and how you gain and maintain it, it's hearts and minds, you know.
And if you control the kinds of experiences that people can have, you're controlling the ideas that they can think and the kinds of people that they become. So it's like downstream from that is, you know, your personality, you know. So it's to restrict the kinds of experiences you have is you know, it has knock-on effects to, you know, freedom of thought and expression and all the rest.
I'm not always the best at this, but Nishay has asked to give, I guess, a brief rundown of some historical things that have, I would say, that were kind of a watershed moment for this collection or this iteration of Psymposia and the team, which is sort of going back. So I had been around, and I sort of hinted earlier at the phytochemical analysis type stuff. I helped moderate the DMT Nexus for a number of years, which was an online forum for basically focusing on classic psychedelics with an emphasis on DMT.
Which was personally very influential to me. So thank you for your service, Dave.
For sure. And so we had, in around like 2012, we'd put together a crowdsourced database of plants used in ayahuasca and some other ethnobotanical preparations. We had access to a lab in Spain run by the wonderful folks at Energy Control, who now they accept international substance samples. So if you want to get stuff tested by like proper analytical equipment, you can send it to them. They've got a website. It's great. But we put together this database. It was based on like plants collected in the wild. It was based on plants that were available on the sort of gray marketplace. We produced all the data. I ran into Nishay at a rainbow gathering, sort of total fluke coincidence. She invited me to present at Psychedemia at UPenn in 2012. And that sort of kicked off a whole bunch of other public appearances at MAPS events, at Breaking Convention in the UK, sort of discussing the need for underground research, how much stuff doesn't make it into sort of sanctioned studies, either because you could never get it past an institutional review board, based on like, you know, people wanting to experiment on themselves with alphabetamines and novel substances.
Can I jump in with something, Dave? One of the things that you talked to me about the DMT Nexus about a while back that I just thought was so fun, and a great example of what wouldn't make it in like past a review board, or the simultaneous like takeoffs around
2006.
Synchronized hyperspace events where so you got a bunch of drug nerds who are like, oh, like the DMT experience seems so immersive, and like there's all of these potentials for like being in touch with each other. What if we all smoke it at the same time in different places and see like, can we meet up in hyperspace? You know, the answer was a resounding no.
I assumed.
Shocking, I'm sure. But then, I mean, you've got people, well, and you've got straight-laced researchers who are now proposing, you know, extended state DMT experiences with, I mean, there's all sorts of issues around that sort of stuff, I think. But
anesthesia devices.
Yeah. So that kind of led, like I was saying, like into some of the more social and political critiques, which so there's a company, Compass Pathways, that's, you know, sort of gunning for psilocybin therapy. They've got one of their
the Fire Nation.
Yes. One of their investors is Peter Thiel, and a whole bunch of other sort of sordid cast of characters associated with him. So I started, when I first got awareness of that, I kind of did whatever little bit I could to raise the alarm. As a result of the work I'd done up to that point, I had connections with a bunch of researchers. I made a large sort of Facebook post, open letter, tagged everyone and was like, hey, this is the stuff that's going on. Here are some of my concerns. I'm not going to like weigh in on this because I have plenty of my own opinions, but I think it would be good for the community to hear all of your considerations. And basically, like, I just invited public discussion, and there were crickets. You know, none of the researchers wanted to weigh in. I think people saw it as professional.
And this was
risk.
after they had already signed on to like a big statement
letter,
kind of against some of this stuff, like an open science statement. So it's not like they hadn't taken a stand before either.
Right. So they'd taken a public stance saying that they were for sort of the information commons and the preservation thereof. But, you know, it's at the point where it was starting to get a little hot, nobody really wanted to engage.
It was toothless.
It
was toothless.
Yeah, absolutely.
Or proved to be toothless.
So trying to push the envelope around some of that, I ended up giving a few talks, including to a bunch of the MAPS folks and corporate actors and people who are, I don't know, movers and shakers in the space, you might say. And through that process, I mean, I really got linked up with the Psymposia folks and was back into dialogue with Nishay, and really throwing up that beacon, sort of thinking back to some of the more Occupy style tactics, and sort of trying to apply some of the street action components. Like, I didn't really care about swaying the people who were already skeptical. It was more about finding the others and saying like, hey, like if you're in the psychedelic space and you're down with a radical critique and like material analysis, like let's link up and see what we can do. And
rather than constantly like fighting over like the basic premises of the conversation, like we wanted to see what would happen if we start a conversation with people who like share the basic assumptions and can actually like be on the same page about some of these things.
Yeah, where you don't have to have the "what if capitalism is actually good" conversation ad nauseum.
Over and over, yeah.
So I've read a lot of pretty compelling Steven Pinker articles. So
better angels of our nature.
One of the things that fell out of that was I gave a talk in 2018 called "The Dire Need for Systemic Critique in Psychedelic Communities," and I sort of laid out a very early vision of this is how monopolies work. This is how vertical integration works. This is the stuff that Peter Thiel has done. This is why I'm concerned about Compass. But also, if we extrapolate from this, like, here are some of the larger concerns, whether it's about surveillance capitalism or just the reproduction of dominant values, the respectability politics games that people are playing, and just sort of laid it all out on a panel that Rick Doblin actually flew in to like rebut the points that he thought I was going to make. And so following that, and maybe about a year or so later.
And Rick Doblin, just in case anyone who watches this doesn't know, he's the person who runs the Multidisciplinary Association for Psychedelic Studies. He's the executive director.
So a little over a year after that, the North Star Foundation put out a comic. Yes, Pace, we're going there. We're going there because Nishay asked me to.
No, I know. I knew we were going there.
They put out a comic called "We Will Call It Pala." Yeah. That was basically an artist's imagining of some of the like dystopian. Huh?
It's a comic book, kind of in the style of, for those who are familiar with, of Randall Munroe of XKCD. So it's like a stick figure, but also like really well done.
No style.
Kind of thing. Yeah,
it had some nice aesthetic. I mean,
it communicates really well.
Yeah, and it took a lot of the concerns and anxieties that I had expressed, and it turned them into the type of narrative that we have since learned has been widely shared among the corporate heads as a, I don't want to do that, but like, tell me how to not do that. And it had a rather recuperative ending as far as yeah, go ahead, Nishay.
There's this idea that like by naming the problem of like what can happen with unscrupulous like monopolization of psychedelic medicine and having good intentions, you're somehow exempt from, you're going to prevent that from happening, right? Which is like, it doesn't actually follow. So it's like they're using the radical critiques that Dave raised and repackaging it as like a liberal project of, what's the phrase, enlightened capitalism or
conscious capitalism.
Conscious capitalism. Yeah. So it's like by having good intentions, you can make a good version of capitalism and then use psychedelics with that.
And if you say that you're opposed to the worst ills or to the exploitativeness or the,
the excesses.
Yeah, exactly. Exactly. They're excess. And I think it's been really frustrating for us to sort of see the way that that's been deployed and used and like turned into, it became its own beacon, right? And they created this ethics pledge that was toothless, that had no, we had already
self-admittedly toothless.
Like we were
said it
on
camera
panel with them, and they had a panel called "Growing Teeth," and they literally spent more time talking about carrots than sticks. Like they didn't actually have time to get to sticks.
Well, didn't they
what this
outright
means-
say that they wouldn't name
Yeah.
names? Or like,
yeah, what this means in
on
context
Lucid, I
is
think.
like it's like this ethics pledge, like not to take over too much, but like the idea is that like this is the beacon. This is what socially responsible capitalism looks like in the psychedelic space. And but it's all voluntary, and we certainly aren't going to name anybody that might be at the basis of why we might need such a thing.
Yeah, it would be a step too far to allow criticism.
No, there's going to be sacred reciprocity from the businesses, even when the people who are running those businesses are also invested in other businesses that actively destroy indigenous land bases. It's okay because the psychedelic corporations are going to give a portion of their earnings back to the indigenous folks. So it all works. Yeah.
And so I went to one of the early like psychedelic investor conferences when for-profits were kind of taking off in the space. And one of the people there, one of the audience members asked them, what do you think of sacred reciprocity? Is that a thing that you're considering? And they were like, well, right now we just need to build pools of capital. And I think if we have pools of capital, that'll just kind of fall into place down the line somewhere. Okay.
Yeah. First, we need to focus on making money, but your points are noted.
So yeah, I mean, for us, like watching this enclosure and watching this sort of same old song and dance, like it was painful the first time, but now and having gotten so much pushback and the labeling of being malcontents or too radical or extremists, or I mean, the list goes on, right? And yet now here we are 2.5, 3 years later, where people are saying, oh my God, have you seen what's happening? This is terrible. And it's like,
Tim Ferriss is saying that.
Yeah.
It's like, the stuff that Dave was talking about
around for a while.
3 years ago. Yeah.
So figuring out how to pick up those pieces and reach out, I mean, this is, as we've said a few times, this was part of the reason to figure out how to pivot away from the echo chamber and try to reach folks who are, in line with the analysis.
Already on side.
Yeah.
You probably, Matt, you probably, already know what it's like to be called the real fascist. My
constant critique of fascist organizations often has me called the real fascist.
Yeah.
Because I criticize the Proud Boys, which you wouldn't do unless you were a fascist.
Right.
That's what the fascists did. If you look at Nazi history, the first thing they did was they researched and made YouTube videos about people. That's how it all started.
Yeah. No, I mean, but this idea that that you have an opinion that you're willing to discuss and not immediately back down when somebody calls you a name or says that's dumb, makes you somehow a supporter of uniformity of ideology.
It's the idea that having an opinion is forcing other people to adopt that opinion.
Yeah, so we get that kind of thing a lot, and I don't know. Yeah. I think we've collectively taken a bit of solace from your your material. You're out there doing really important basic education work, but also really topical stuff. Like I saw your super straight thing. I mean, or rather contemporary, not so much topical, but you're on it in a way that is going to make you a target for these, I don't know, for these people who have bad opinion havers.
They try. The thing is what none of those people can handle is I think one of the things that, and I hate to toot my own horn, those of you that are familiar with me will know I'm not a very self-congratulatory person. I don't like to pat myself on the back. But
Matt,
I think with those people that like to present you as an extremist or as someone that is so off the wall, they don't know what to do with somebody that is laughing and enjoying themselves.
Yeah.
And that's not the reason I do that in my videos. I do that because I like making jokes. I like making people laugh, but they don't know how to handle that. And you can see them trying to just pretend that you're really angry, rather than deal with your argument, they just go, look how upset he is. Look how upset he is about all of this. You know, why is he so upset? That's not normal.
Yeah, I mean, pretty much
except,
anything to distract from the point. Sorry, Nishay.
Yeah.
Well, this is kind of an interesting, like one thing that I was hoping we could touch on was just our recent Martin Ball, because just the humor element of that I think is really relevant to this conversation.
Buckle your seatbelt because you're
Anybody
in
want
for
to recap this
wild
one?
ride. I think Nishay should.
I don't know if I can.
I'll start at the start because all right. So fuck. We were sort of aware of
we found a fucked up video.
That's basically it. You know, we found a fucked up video, but we found some other fucked up videos. We knew who Martin Ball was. He's like a kind of a strange individual, very into 5-MeO DMT. For those of you who aren't aware, it's like it's the toad venom. It's also synthesized, it's smoked, very, very potent tryptamine.
And it's not the same as DMT as
DMT.
It's not exactly the same. And no, you don't lick the toads.
I mean, you can. It's just not going to get you high.
You can lick any toad.
You can lick any.
You got a tongue. You can lick something.
Right, but you're not going to get the same effects as if you smoke the venom. So, Martin Ball has been somebody who's been a voice in that. Dr. Martin Ball has been a voice in that world for a while.
Well, there's that sub community, the 5 community, has like an especially high level of like psychedelic authoritarian servers who just feel like they are kind of God's gift to humanity, and they know exactly like how to provide 5 to people that's for their best, whatever. And we originally, like, Martin Ball a few years ago came across the radar of folks on the scene because he was running a conference out in Oregon, and someone had questioned a different 5 server, Octavio Redig, who has like actual bodies, like
people have died.
He's killed people. He tases people on 5, waterboards them on 5, kicks them on 5. Like,
it's not even joking. That's like their own exaggeration.
Fucking wild.
And people were.
To what end?
Because that's
to
what they
get them
need.
off their drugs.
To getting them to drop their ego.
Yeah. So these authoritarians, like, they feel like by abusing you and torturing you, that's what you need to get over yourself and to get over your problems.
I can see your ego reacking.
Yeah.
We're gonna have to do some.
Yeah. It's
that just puts you further in your ego. Like,
right.
how you're feeling it. It's not.
No, none of this.
It's good logic,
makes sense. Yeah. No, but so there was a conference where like people were trying to have conversations around like feminist and diversity perspectives on psychedelics, and people were raising the concerns about this person who had bodies in their closet, from serving, and he completely lost, as the MC of the conference, lost the plot, started cursing, screaming. You can hear in the recording like young children
Martin
start
Ball
crying
did.
in the background because of how he started screaming and cursing. Yeah, Martin Ball. So that's a big red flag right there. If you're willing to go to that.
He was defending Octavio. He was mad that people were critiquing
him. So if you're gonna be cursing at people to that extent who are trying to raise like concerns about these kinds of practices, like, chances are there's some weird reason that you feel so strongly about defending those types of practices. And sure enough, how long ago was this? 2 months ago?
About 2 months ago. Yeah. So like I came across a video while doing some other research of Martin Ball at a talk. So like there's a movement of psychedelic societies, so I think Toronto actually has one.
High societies, please.
Okay. All right. So yeah, so I run one and have run one in Columbus for some time, called My Manifest Midwest. There's sort of citizen ways to talk about something. There's not a lot of places to do that. In any case, there's one called the Los Angeles Medicinal Plant Society, LAMPS, and in 2016 they hosted Martin Ball to just talk, which he did for like almost 2.5 hours.
As
and-
people would repeat ad nauseum after.
Yeah.
Yes, you
we
have to
start
watch the full
covering this.
video.
You have
which
to
is
watch the
intense.
full video. You're taking him out of context. Well, what we took out of context was, several points in which Martin Ball, in regaling the audience with the tales of his 5-MeO DMT facilitation, talked about throwing up on clients' heads on
And-
multiple occasions.
And touching their
touching-
genitals while they were
Because they needed
both
it.
they
Shoving
they
his
needed it.
thumbs down their throat.
Yeah,
to the point of gagging.
he pantomimes too.
Yeah,
Um,
he so you can
So
visualize
Northwell's
it.
on 5-MeO DMT while he is serving 5-MeO DMT.
Well, he doesn't say
which-
he's serving. He describes it as non-dual energetic therapy.
right.
Oh, it's non-dual. Okay, never mind.
Yeah. I just wanted.
Yeah, if he's serving it, that's a problem. But I didn't realize it was. Yeah.
There.
Yeah.
I mean, he's not a server anyway. He's a practitioner, which is
Right.
a very
Participant.
storied kind of. It's an elite status. but-
Very few people
um,
are qualified, and he says as much. He says, you're probably
Mm-hmm.
not going to get to the level of this type of practicing, but
Mm-hmm.
your clients may need you to vomit on them, and they will appreciate it. If,
they will
if
appreciate
their
it.
energy requires that.
And one of the
he's
Verbatim.
processing their
Again,
energy.
can't stress that's not an exaggeration.
yeah. And one of the most alarming anecdotes he shared was how old was the woman?
79-year-old.
years old.
79-year-old woman who stopped breathing, which is something that sometimes happens with 5-MeO. And rather than provide any kind of CPR or, other actual medical support, he decided, just based on his intuition, which is how he operates, to
While on
put,
drugs.
while on 5 himself, to put his tongue in the woman's mouth, to get on top of her and put his tongue into her mouth while she was not breathing.
And press
And
against her
he-
tongue.
Yeah.
Gently.
Sure. Yeah.
He feels that the intimacy of that was what brought her back. But so all of this, from
Aw.
us, yeah. We were just really alarmed, just about and also alarmed at how the audience was really excited about all
Like
of
chuckling
what he was,
with
yeah,
him.
they thought he was really great and everything he was saying was really impressive. But so we were like, okay, this is clearly a problematic ideology
Well,
that this
and-
guy's sharing.
Even more alarmed also because Dr. Ball appears on the cover of Mark Hayden's book, Mark Hayden being the former executive director of
Outgoing
MAPS
of MAPS
Canada,
Canada.
which is like doing clinical trials and stuff. And his manual for
So, yeah, he's
psychedelic
at the
guides,
bottom.
which Case is holding up there.
Martin Ball,
He's like-
PhD.
Yeah.
So the
he did
head
the editing and
guy-
publishing of that book.
The head guy of Canada's MAPS, organization doing the medicalization, his guide for facilitators, is edited, published by this person. So he's not just a rando, he's actually has institutional support. But so we strategized about, okay, what do we do with this information? Clearly we should say something, warn people about this. And so Russ has this
Russell.
he has a side channel where he does, well, I don't know. Well, he has an
Well, I took it all.
Oh, you did?
Yeah.
Russell makes videos. He's quite good at it.
Talk about it another time.
Do you know what's the guy's
Vic
name?
Berger.
Vic Berger's like style of like editing. He did a Vic Berger on this Martin Ball video and just kind of like condensed down the really disturbing parts, but like made it darkly humorous in a way that it was like kind of impossible to ignore how disturbing it was. But because of this, it created this huge wave, like for
The word is shitstorm.
shitstorm. Yeah, it
Like a
created a
shitstorm.
shitstorm where people were like, "Whoa!" Because this person who has a lot of clout in the community is describing this stuff, and it was really interesting to see the ways that people were like, they were moved really quickly to discredit us. Like we became the problem. We edited him out
Well,
of
and-
context. Oh,
yeah.
go ahead. You talk
Well, yeah, I
about
was
it.
gonna say
Russell,
the
please tell the
context
story.
was people were very upset that we had condensed a 2.5-hour video into like 10 minutes of clips. But it's worth noting that we did release this in conjunction with like a long article in which we had reached out to Martin Ball and talked to him about all this stuff and had him on record about all of this stuff too, where he just doubled down on everything he said. So it being out of context was kind of a silly point to me, as he like went on to double down on everything he talked about in like 3 podcasts where he like spotlighted me and like how I needed more education, and he like framed podcasts around teaching me and things like that. And like
does anybody remember Clint Eastwood talking to the empty chair to talk to Obama?
Yeah,
that's what Martin Ball did for
that's what it
3
felt
hours
like.
to Russell Hausfeld.
I was kind of making a joke about this earlier when we were talking about Jordan Peterson, but to the degree to which taking someone out of context has become such a thought-terminating cliche, where like, yes, I did take them out of context because I don't have time to explain the context. Like if I just repeated the context and the claim, it would be as long as the original thing. I'm shortening it, but like, that just because I took that out of context doesn't mean that I'm misrepresenting the context.
Right.
You know?
Well, and not only that, but we were never hiding the context. We had the time
linked to the full video
and the original video linked to everything.
And there's also something subtly different, in my opinion anyway. It's like removing it from the original video is not necessarily like taking the words out of context. Like if you change the meaning, like if somebody said, oh, it's not this thing, and then proceeded to give an example and you just cut the example, to me, it's like, okay, that's taking it out of context. In these cases, they were like clips of him, you know, joyfully recounting how much his clients supposedly appreciate being vomited on and things of that nature.
Pantomiming orgasmic feelings while showing them rubbing his vomit on their faces.
So, you know, like looking at some of the responses, and that's just it, right? The taking out of context was a big one. This is a bad faith position, like the way
Good
that
faith,
people,
bad faith, good faith, bad
yeah,
faith.
like it all seems quite fascinating in the way that like trying to get an engagement with like what could ethical practices look like. Like personally, I don't care that this is in the context of mainstream. Like I don't have like the notion to be like, hey guys, this is going mainstream, like clean up your act so we don't get in trouble, which seemed to be where a lot of people were coming from when they were like, oh, we do have concerns around this because, you know, if we're trying to get
about the
medicalization,
Renaissance, like that's the angle, not the people, but the Renaissance.
Well, and that the notion of harming the Renaissance comes back to these sort of authoritarian dynamics on a bunch of fronts where we've seen, you know, there's at least one clinical trial participant who was sexually abused by the therapist, and the therapist team covered it up, you know, up in Canada. There have been other cases where seeing the sort of things that happen and then the community sort of rallying around to say, well, we can't let this get out because that will set us all back. And I don't know. I think internally there's a decent amount of awareness, but externally, I don't know. Like I wonder how, sort of looking at your reaction around like the psychonaut term, right? Like once you see what
Psycho-Nazi.
yeah. Once you see what it takes for the sausage to get made, it starts raising some questions. Sorry, Nisha, I didn't mean to.
Oh no, I was just gonna say that like people would point to like, first of all, the fact that there was like a humorous element as a way of discounting it, the video, and also looking at our back catalog, you know, especially the website and our pieces that we've, you know, written over the, you know, years or so, anti-capitalist perspective is like, oh, look, they're just these, you know, crazy leftists, don't take anything seriously. They just want clicks. They just want
well, we all know that if you say something humorously, it's just you can't take it seriously, right?
Well, so it was just
definitionally, kind of.
That's true. It was just kind of like frustrating. I mean, that's one of the things we wanted to talk to you about, just because having your own kind of solo gig, but also relationships with, you know, other people on BreadTube, and just it's been very exhausting for us being a minority in the psychedelic community. But like, it's been very helpful and kind of therapeutic to have a team to be able to weather some of this, like, you know, what verges on gaslighting from other corners of the space. And so just like, we're interested in hearing from you what it's been like coming up in YouTube as BreadTube came online, you know, and just forming relationships, but also just what it's like to kind of have a lot on your own shoulders, you know, being like a, especially on such a strict schedule as a solo creator.
Yeah, well, that's kind of self-imposed in my case. But I would say another big downside is that, like, I have no one to call me on my bullshit that I can trust. Because if you have a following around my size, and that I'm trying to say it in a way that doesn't sound like I'm bragging, it's very shameful. I'm not bragging, but the you are constantly called on what people imagine to be your bullshit. So you kind of develop this, oh, I shouldn't listen to anyone type of mentality that is very problematic. But yeah, in terms of like having a team, it's like, it's almost kind of, it's interesting, right? The idea of BreadTube. BreadTube isn't like a group of people that talk to each other, right? Like, I don't know half of the people that I am supposedly in this organization with. It's just like it's a genre of YouTube video, if anything. And not all of us get along, and not all of us have the same perspectives, and not all of us are friends. Some of us are, but even to the degree that we are, it's like, I don't check in with anybody before I make a video, you know, like and like you can tell, because I will occasionally make videos that someone else has already made a video about, and I try to, like, you know, give credit to people who've gotten there before I do, but that can be difficult too. I feel like I'm rambling. I don't know if I've answered your question.
No, you're not rambling.
No,
It's fascinating. And
well,
I think
for our listeners, what's like a 101 on what BreadTube is? Because I don't know if everyone would know that.
Oh, yeah,
A couple times it's came up. I'm like, I wonder if they think we're talking about a porn site.
Yeah, we're talking about baguettes. BreadTube is a YouTube it's a term. It's a broader term for leftist YouTube. It shouldn't be. The term bread in BreadTube refers to a book by Piotr Kropotkin, The Conquest of Bread, which is a book about the potential of an anarcho-communist type of society, and how a social revolution might occur, and what the society might look like after that, and how it might be organized. But as it has kind of grown in popularity and infamy, the term has almost become sort of a pejorative in a sense, because now it just applies to anyone who has politics that are non-fascist. Like, if you just don't want to exterminate anyone, someone will argue that you're part of BreadTube, and so you are therefore, as someone part of BreadTube, you are responsible for the opinions of everyone else who I decide are also part of this community with you.
Well, so it's like the anti-intellectual dark web.
In a sense, yeah.
There's something that you said that I think, you know, I find really interesting, because I feel like when you were talking about the sort of insulating against people calling you on your not bullshit, right? Like people calling you on their projection of your bullshit, or what they want to, you know, what they're going to identify as your bullshit. And I think with some of the stuff we've experienced around like gaslighting, or just straight up being told things that are, you know, demonstrably untrue or what have you, that like there is, and at a much, you know, with a drastically hard to overstate, right, how drastically smaller our following is, but also seeing some of that already, like the need to like double and triple check, like, wait, is there something legitimate to engage with here? Is there really a concern? Is there a harm? Has something, like, did we do something in a way that like bears following up on? I can't imagine what that's like to have, you know, that sort of chorus of voices. I mean, similarly, like looking at social media, and when something we have gets some very, very minor, like it's not even right to call it virality, right? Just the deluge of inputs. I can't imagine being in a position of a creator where like I can't, like, I literally can't understand how somebody keeps up with all of that.
Well, my opinion on that matter is perhaps different from the average creators. And mine is that the only way to maintain positive mental health is to limit people's access to you.
Yeah.
And I make it very clear to people that, like, I'm not going to answer all your emails. I'm not going to read all your comments. I'm not going to read all your ats on Twitter. I'm not going to necessarily respond to your DMs, because if you train people that, like, they always can speak to you, they can always talk to you, it never ends. And it's not only is that not healthy for me, it's not healthy for other people. There has to be a boundary for them too, because that's another thing I talk about a lot is I am not, just because you know my work, that doesn't mean we're friends. You might feel like you know me very well. You don't. There's all sorts of stuff I do in my life that maybe if you knew me closer, you'd think I was a huge piece of shit. And people, when I say that, people tend to say, "Oh, you're being so hard on yourself," and that's not the point. The point is you're giving me a power that it might be safe to give to me, because I'm not going to abuse it, I don't think. But if you just go around giving that power to people, eventually someone will.
You're talking about parasocial relationships, and
yes,
I speak as somebody who's probably formed one with you. So
there's nothing wrong with that, but I think it's what gets to me is when people go like, "Oh, hey, Thought Slime, you're such a good person," and I'm like, "You don't know it.
Yeah, totally.
You don't know me. You cannot make that judgment." Of course, the videos I make online, I'm not going to present myself as a bad person. Like, I'm not going to get up and like, "Oh, here's all the mean things I did today." Like,
there's good money in that for some people.
Yeah, I mean, Steven Crowder they built an empire on that.
True. Like, just saying.
Well, hey, I think that was like super helpful, both in the explanation of BreadTube and like how you're situated, but also like, I don't know if you intended it as advice, but I think that it was healthy for us to hear that, because like, look, like, we're in the business of, the not business, because we're a goddamn nonprofit.
You're a nonprofit.
But like, we're in the practice of, challenging institutions, corporations, popular individuals who have done abusive things, and advancing a critique that may not be the least like path of resistance, and in doing so, like, we're not doing so because we are intentionally trying to upset people. We're not doing so because we like to stir the pot, which is, I guess, another way of saying the same thing. But like, doing these sorts of things tends to make enemies and people not like you. But like, whenever we've gotten to a point in a conversation kind of like this where we've sort of had enough information about what we're doing and why we're doing it, we usually state pretty clearly that the main reason why we're doing what we're doing is that we actually we care a lot, and it matters to us, and it's worth wading through some of this negative reaction, because the things that we're advocating for, and the stories that we're telling, the narratives that we're pushing are important enough to do that.
So, and there's another part too that comes up in regards to what Matt just said, where it's like, I hear you around the access, and I think one of the things that ends up sort of playing out, like, there's a really great Chomsky quote on concision where he talks about sort of not getting invited. Somebody asks why he isn't on more nighttime shows, and he talks about like the structural constraints of when you need to fit in 3 minutes between ad segments, right? And that, like, if you say unconventional things where you have to take all of the time to unpack and explain and present it to the audience because they're not used to hearing it, he makes a point in that quote where he points out that like the audience has every right to sort of ask, well, why did you say that thing that I've never heard anyone say? And I think we come from a perspective of like, yeah, we're saying things that we don't want to upset people, but they're likely to upset people or confuse people or to make them ask, like, why did you say that thing that you said? And it feels important to take the time and unpack it and present it, which of course opens you up as well to invoke the term I brought up earlier, bad faith, people who just want to sort of like pick away at it and suck up your time and your energy and all of that. But, you know, grappling with those two sides of it, particularly when you're in or engaging with like more hostile space or actors, it becomes a weird balancing act. I also wanted to ask Matt, like, are there things like, I know we've sort of soaked up a lot of the speaking time. Like, are there things around psychedelics that you want to talk about and that we could just like,
fuck yeah,
shoot the shit around?
Honestly, this conversation has been so liberating for me. Like validating for me, because first of all, it's so rare that I get into a discussion about this subject where people teach me things, and I'm very grateful for that. And it's also just like I spend so much time in isolation thinking about these things and thinking about them in this way that I feel it's very like alienating. But to just the fact that y'all think in a similar way is just it's very it's a breath of fresh air. I used to say this we used to have meetups in Toronto when people were allowed to see each other face to face, and it was just like that was like, you know, you talk to other leftists and you would say like, oh yeah, you know, it's because capitalism, and they'd go yeah, and you wouldn't have to then have a discussion about like,
absolutely.
Well, if you look at world poverty, according to the World Bank, you know, okay,
right.
Yeah, no, I actually referenced that video. You talked about that to these folks like back when we were starting to watch your videos and talk about them, and it really resonated with that, like, you know, finding the others and people who you can like start out on side with, you know, to an extent, and then, you know, like at least with the basics, and then, you know, because you can learn things and you can develop your ideas in a way that, you know, by having that feedback from people who are not automatically going to question everything you're saying or give you shit for it, it's really valuable. So I mean, we got kind of that intuition, I think, from those little slips of references that you know, with your politics and your interests, that you might be one of the, if you were to, you know, run into one of these psychedelic conferences, you might have bumped into us in the hallway and we might have had a cool conversation. So
one thing actually that I think we didn't discuss, and I don't know if this is like too long a discussion point for me to bring up now in the 11th hour, but something I've been thinking about a lot lately is cultural appropriation in psychedelic spaces. And the way that, like, I think about the story of Maria Sabina and how she would say that the mushrooms at the end of her life, they didn't work anymore because people were taking them not to heal themselves, but to meet God. And I think like it's easy for me to look at that story and like kind of judge the people that like sought her out and like went to her village and made her life kind of miserable. But that's not that different from what I'm doing when I'm taking mushrooms. And how do I square that, you know?
We can talk about that. I think that's a good because I mean, you know, there's sort of a guilt aspect, and like, I don't know, I've traveled a lot in Latin America and Mexico, and in particular I teach Maria Sabina to my students and sort of recontextualize Gordon Wasson not as, you know, the person who brought mushrooms to the world. It's just not even true. Like, somebody showed Gordon Wasson mushrooms and her name was Doña Maria Sabina, and she suffered greatly while Gordon Wasson built a career as an ethnomycologist. He built a discipline, and, you know, like, in fairness to Wasson, he made contributions that are useful, but the reality is that Maria Sabina's house was burned down, her son was killed, she died penniless, You know, Lydia Jimenez, her town was locked down under military rule for 2 years, you know. But here's the thing, like, okay, so the knowledge is out, the cat's out of the bag, and obviously that didn't serve Maria Sabina well. And I think that there is something to be said about cultural debt. A part of my education is in the world of climate change, and in climate change, like there's this discourse about climate justice and climate debt. So look, the reality is that the reason why Gordon Wasson could be cast as somebody rediscovering mushrooms is because colonization crushed those traditions in the most brutal, torturous fashion possible. They were beaten into hiding, and besides all of that, you know, a lineage with Maria Sabina, and I can only assume many others, but also in the peyote tradition that was never really fully colonized in the first place. Like it survived, and it carried a torch, and it carried a torch to the present, and that torch lit a fire, and that fire was knowledge. And you know, people like Paul Stamets, who we've talked about briefly. He's a mycologist, but they discovered that there were other species that were endemic to other places.
One of them's a hat.
Right. One of them's a hat.
Are you guys familiar with Paul Stamets' cool hat?
I am. Yeah. It's a polypore that he's pounded. It's a European tradition. Yeah. It is a pretty cool hat though.
So because, just as a real quick interjection, because we're here to spoil your fun, Matt, and ruin all the things that you hold dear. Paul Stamets has recently submitted a patent to include every compound in Pikal and Tikal.
Everything in this book here.
As part of his Stamets stack. So although Shulgin put it out there into the public domain, Stamets is now trying to carve out a little piece for himself. Granted, as part of his Stamets stack, nootropic, whatever, supplement.
Just like he carved out that hat. That's where it all started.
Bingo. Right. I mean,
he added niacin to it. I mean, come on.
Yeah.
You add B vitamins to the Shulgin compounds. You deserve credit for that.
And a little mushroom too. Why not? But also to Pace's point, I mean, looking at, you know, we're all on occupied land, right? Like we're all living in a context where colonization and, you know, genocide and slavery played out in various ways, and now we are alive living with those legacies and lineages and ongoing histories in the present. And there's a thing like, so when I think about it, right, like some of the, whether it's awareness of local and naturally occurring endemic mushrooms, or if it's DMT containing plants or grasses or shrubs or whatever that grow like all across the world. Like for me, I think what happened around Maria Sabina and Huatla de Jimenez is instructive to look at what is going on with regards to ayahuasca, but then to also apply some political analysis to it. It's like the same way that I don't particularly believe in or ascribe to so-called third world activism, where like I don't believe that like I should be going down to like save the people of wherever. Like for me, like I ascribe strongly to a fight where you stand sort of position. And like when I look, like the forces of colonization and imperialism and capitalism, like they're alive and well, unfortunately, around me. And so figuring out like at the point where there is awareness to these substances and access to experiences that I've encountered to catalyze certain socio-political insights, then to me, it's like if I can apply those insights towards deconstructing the coercive and oppressive systems that I find in the world, that feels to me more personally constructive than like hand-wringing about some of the questions of appropriation, which isn't to say that I don't think those questions or those discussions belong. I do think they're frequently reduced from like an intersectional discussion of the different sort of class and race and other sort of privilege and access that exists into some very binary or if not caricatured, like a lot of the discussions that I've encountered seem very reductive, you know, in the same way that, say, like Fred Hampton was willing to explicitly discuss Black capitalists and the problems they're in. Like, I don't think just because somebody looks a certain way or has ties to a certain lineage or history, like questions about what they're doing in the present and what their social and political analyses are seem important if we're going to engage productively with what's a very hairy issue.
Sure.
And there's kind of, I mean, there's like a cultural appropriative like difference between just taking mushrooms, say, and then, or claiming that you are a mushroom shaman of a certain tradition without having been like even part of a lineage or anything. Like, I think that's, to me, where that question comes.
Well, that brings
like,
it back to
if
like
you stormed the Capitol and did a smudging ceremony inside, like for example.
For example, Jesus.
Yes.
Right. That guy, Jake Angeli, is like he's like, well, first of all, we wouldn't bat an eyelash if we saw him at like Burning Man, you know?
No.
So the fact that he was, you know, some sort of Q Nazi is interesting. But like,
I mean, I would, to be clear, I might not bat it. I wouldn't be surprised to see him at Burning Man. I would still be annoyed to see him at Burning Man.
you'd still bat those eyelashes. I get you.
I wouldn't bat. I would bat them like
slow
blink.
Yeah.
Well, so appropriation in my like understanding in its sort of original like why it was brought up as an issue was the profiting of things that are part of people's ethnic identities that perhaps they had been punished for in the past. And there really is an element that is happening right now with psychedelics, like the fact that Compass Pathways, you know, has filed a process patent on the crystal polymorph A of psilocybin, you know, it should upset people that something that, you know, is a product of, first of all, 100 million years of evolution on the basis, you know, of fungal innovation, and then secondary, you have, you know, Mazatec discovery and utility of the sort of psychological technology that it enables, to then come along and say, well, we found a better way to process it. So now it's ours. Like that. Yeah, that I think there's a very
better
fair
way. It's not really even like necessary. It's like a way. And
it's a fair appropriative thing. Anyhow, Nishay, you were saying.
I was just gonna say, like, working towards like intersectional liberation and like freedom from oppression seems like a totally valid way to, you know, contextualize use of those substances. You know, if it's something that you're trying to like fight for, like just so you can have fun on your own and you're okay with your neighbors like starving to death, like that to me is a problem. But if you're working towards educating people, forming community, cultivating relationships towards the ends of pushing back against colonization, for example, like I'm okay with that personally.
Yeah, it's probably also worth noting that none of us come from, you know, traditions where that would be, you know, like our position on this is as outsiders and as people coming along, you know, at this sort of later stage. And also like
I can't speak for everyone here, but from my perspective, at least as colonizer.
Sure.
Yeah, totally. You know, that said, I'm interested in the idea that you know, psychedelics are something that, you know, humanity has encountered and embraced and forgotten and repressed and rediscovered many times in our long history. And it's you know, I think that it's unlikely that you know, any of us come from a lineage where none of our ancestors ever engaged in psychotropic plants or fungi, like or even fish or toads, because there's a lot of ways to stumble into weird states of mind, and given a long enough time scale, many things are possible.
Have I don't know if asking this question is going to provoke laughter, but I wanted to bring this up earlier, but has anyone here read the book The Immortality Key?
Oh yeah, recently. It came out just recently.
Yeah, I wanted to bring it up earlier because when we were talking about quacks, it has an intro by Graham Hancock.
Yeah.
And when I was reading that, I was like, this is really interesting. I got to look into this. And I read his Wikipedia article, and I was like,
Graham
okay.
Hancock's.
Yeah. He's
That's
an Ancient
how all
Aliens
his writing
guy.
is for me.
He
It's
is an
like,
Ancient
oh, you
Aliens
read it,
guy.
and it's like, this is awesome. This is really
Oh,
exciting.
yeah.
And then it's like, oh, well, it's a little loose.
Well, it's very much written in the style of Graham Hancock, and that's why he's there. And Brian Murkowski, I think that's how you pronounce it.
Oh, really?
I could be wrong. What is it?
I think it's like Murrah Rescue.
There you go. Thank you. I'm the guy who mispronounces everything. So, in the immortality, oh my God. Well, so look, first of all, I have a tattoo that I got before this book came out, and it talks about the theories of Ruck and Hoffman and Wasson, which Murkowski talks a lot about, and does provide good evidence that he did not, he is a popularizer, he's not a primary researcher. So he popularized some research that I thank him for. He popularized the research that some Catalan researchers did of a Greek colony where they were performing what seems to be an offshoot of the Eleusinian mysteries to Demeter and Persephone. And they did archaeochemistry on several vessels, which were in the style that was used in Greece for 1700 years at the actual Eleusinian mysteries. And then they discovered that it contained, barley and ergot. And so they effectively confirmed the theories of Karl Ruck, Hoffman, and Wasson. And I think that's great. Here is evidence. It's not like a full confirmation that the Eleusinian mysteries was all about ergot, but here's concrete chemical evidence that there was a European psychedelic tradition that was well within sort of established cultic worship. And I think that there's something about that I think is like validating to, we the colonizers, that somewhere in the past there was some tradition seeking these kinds of unitive, transcendent experiences.
There's also an element of like, I don't know how to put this, like romanticizing that to say that, if we can get back to there, then we can share the same space with colonized people without like
I think that's a really fair point.
Yeah, there's an element of like Jay Savalius was talking to us about looking for like a trans gene, something that like justifies a certain kind of like position in a conversation that isn't actually like necessary for the larger conversation. Anyway, I'm not saying that clearly.
But if you wanted trans genes, you just wear jeans that are different. Like I would wear women's jeans, someone who is assigned female at birth could wear male jeans. This joke is so funny. I'm so happy I made this joke.
Well, there's also the element, like even in PCOL, I think Anne writes about, taking psychedelics, or no, even Sasha's part of it talks about taking psychedelics and feeling like you're home, like feeling like, you can't, like, that's a piece of this conversation of like feeling like, oh, I know this, like I know this space and this feels right to me, like that aspect of it, regardless of ancestry or not, like that's a very real recurring theme for some people, not everybody obviously, but when I've written about psychedelic people, I think there's a subsection of the population for whom like that's a really common experience, where it's like
100%.
one of my friends described it as like receiving a letter to Hogwarts and realizing like, oh wait, I'm the different type of person. Like I'm a magical person, and not actually magical, but yeah, you know what I mean. So yeah, so I just wanted to raise that as
no, thank you. I think that's like something that it bridges this conversation a bit, because like, look, there's an intense desire for people to feel validated that their psychedelic use like is okay. But we live in this context, as Dave was talking about, where in many cases through no fault of our own, we stand on colonized land. We're going to strip malls that used to be charnel grounds, and that weight is difficult. And not only that, but it's ongoing. And so there is this sort of like for those of us who have been sort of educated about how being an actor in your life, applying oneself to a cause, that it matters. Like the weight of that can be quite heavy. And so I mean, I guess like both with like appropriation and psychedelic use, like I would say it's okay to like things, it's okay. And I would also say, like, don't base your politics on the 0.001% of the time that you're on drugs. Like,
sure.
A holistic assessment of like what we should be doing or what we want to do, how to build a world that is better for our friends, for us, for our children, or our children's children. Like, these are questions that I think are worth asking.
Well, and that I'm sorry, go Nishay.
No, you go ahead.
No, you go.
So I was saying with my back, like I would notice that I wasn't aware of this tension that I was holding, and I'd be able to like recognize it was there and like twist and stretch and work it out. And in a similar way, like systemically, I feel like there are aspects of our communities and our relationships and our lives that we just don't even recognize are issues and causing pains and problems. And that like by having an altered state of consciousness around it, you can recognize like, oh, whoa, there's this thing that's going on that I can do something about, and I can make it better. And that's like a really valuable tool for, changing things.
Yeah, I think some of that ties back to what Pace had been saying, sort of about looking at what sort of world do we want to create for our children and our grandchildren, and like,
but also right now.
Yeah. And looking again, both at psychedelics or psychedelic experiences as inherently political, and also like, I mean, we've talked about trying to get away from psychedelics for the sake of psychedelics, right? That if you're not applying these things to the world at large, sort of what's the point? And
well, wait.
But
we've also then talked about psychedelics for psychedelics because they're fun.
Yeah. And that's not to throw that under the bus. I just meant in the context of like trying to bring it back to some of the mirror rescue and sort of like the what sort of narratives do we spin about why people are using this, and is this legitimate? The notion that like regardless of the historical evidence or not for the Kukion, like you don't necessarily need to go the Graham Hancock route of fitting every single piece in and saying, oh, I've got a compelling narrative that then justifies our use here in the present. We're really stretching back to these, ancestral practices. You can say, hey, look, like I found a mushroom in this cow patty next door and it does these things. And like, holy shit, that gave me some interesting ideas.
Yeah, funny paper make brain go burr.
Precisely.
Well, so that's the thing, though. There's sort of a transhumanist like element to broader psychedelia that I think some of it goes way too far, but other parts of it, like you look at like Shulgin, he's like, I'm gonna tinker with known psychedelics and make new psychedelics, and they are not the product of like evolution, but we like them anyway. And I mean, I think that the sort of the element of play and experimentation is inherent whenever one has a new perspective, because when you have a new perspective, you're a baby again in a lot of ways. And so suddenly, messing around with something that, whether it's your own body, or whether it's like William Burroughs adopting the cut up technique to literature, it's seeing things with new eyes. There's utility to it, but there's also just the joy of novelty. And I don't know, I think there's something inherently valuable, and something that doesn't need to be justified to that experience, in my opinion.
It's why the most frustrating question you can ask someone about psychedelic drugs is, what kind of things should I have ready to do during my trip? It's like, doesn't matter. You're gonna want to just look at a tree for an hour. Like
Yeah.
You leave out like, oh, I got all these video games I want to play. I got all this music I want to listen to. I want to have real fruit gushers. So I wonder what real fruit gushers are like when I'm on LSD and whippets. It's like, no, it won't matter to you.
Yeah. I mean, there is something to be said about like curation, because like, in the 50s, they'd be like, we're going to inject you with 150 milligrams of LSD and just...
Jesus, micrograms.
Micrograms, thank you. That was
You're like the researchers that killed the elephant.
Yeah, right. Micrograms, thank you. And just lay here on this gurney for, 5 hours. Like,
steel gurney.
It was very, very quick, for people to realize that maybe some fruit gushers and a PlayStation would have been a good addition.
Sure. I'm not saying that it's wrong to eat gushers and play PlayStation. I hope listeners know that. But I think any curation that you do with a sober mind, like kind of the point of a psychedelic is that you're not sober, so your perspective changes.
Yeah.
So the things that are interesting to you when you're sober are not necessarily the things that are going to be interesting to you when you're high. And like my favorite video game of all time is The Binding of Isaac.
Mm-hmm.
And I played it one time under the influence of LSD in a short story I wrote, because obviously I don't do drugs in real life.
Of course not.
But it was like I could not for the life of me understand how I could get any pleasure from playing a video game while I was doing it. It just made zero sense to me. And but it's not like that stuck with me afterwards.
Sure.
It's just I find it's I don't know. Sorry, it's kind of a basic point.
That'd be a pretty dark game to play on psychedelics too, I would imagine.
For many people who have not played thousands of hours of it, I imagine it would be. Yeah.
But there's certain things like, having to interact with screens or menus and stuff like that. Certain psychedelics are definitely not like the best.
On LSD, I've always found, I remember, so I think the first time I interacted with a screen and a keyboard while on LSD was my sophomore year in high school, and I was in health class attempting to enter some data into a school computer, and the letters kept moving around. It was difficult to find the ones that I needed to do the work that I didn't want to do.
The stories of young Pace tripping, whether it's at like World Trade protests or in front of the computer at school, like this is just like the images that I'm getting are fascinating.
We took a tab before setting up our sound system one time, and that was a really, really, really bad idea dealing with chords.
My first time taking LSD, a friend of mine spent like hours trying to hook up a Super Nintendo. Oh my God. So I cannot imagine trying to set up audio shit. Yeah.
There is a certain kind of feedback that you can have when like it's not your first time with a substance and you've gotten a feel for it and you've registered like maybe screen interface isn't exactly what I'm down for, but like there are ways that you can then set up fun activities for yourself, having had a feel for a specific thing, like going to a really cool spot in the woods, you know, that you've sussed out in advance, or like, you know, certain kinds of music curation that you have a feeling would be positive, you know. So there, I think there's like some value in that, but you definitely, if you're like a novice to it, I think not having a lot of expectations is good, where you can just kind of like feel it out. And I like to recommend to people who are new to stay close to your comfies as like kind of like a meme for it. So it's like, you know, have layers, clothes, you know, maybe soft blanket or a nice sweatshirt, but your ability to like strip down if you get hot, make sure you have water, make sure you've been to the bathroom and you know where the bathroom is.
But don't stay too long in the bathroom. You'll get stuck, and don't stare in the mirror too long.
Do not look at the mirror.
Yeah.
However, I've always found the mirror thing for myself to be the opposite. Like I've had very like revelatory moments of being like, wow, why am I so like ashamed of like this part of my body or that part? It's like,
for me, it's like I'll look into the mirror like, oh, I know I'm not supposed to do this, so I'm gonna do it.
It's like a Bloody Mary thing where it's like, oh, I'm gonna do it twice, but not the third time around.
So I'm not even scared. I can look at myself. I'm a big tough guy.
I think Brian's rules for LSD that I developed over time was something like, don't stay in the bathroom for too long. Knives cut, you can't fly, you can't breathe underwater, and red, white, and blue lights are not pretty. So.
Yes.
When you said you cannot fly, it reminds me of the Bill Hicks bit about like, you know, why not try to take off from the ground rather than jumping off of
if you really can fly.
Yeah.
It's like
harm reduction.
There was some movie where it was showing the people who invented skateboarding in a empty pool, like as a pipe.
Is that Dogtown?
And Z-Boys? Maybe
Dog Boys or something, like I can't remember.
Lords of Dogtown or something. They start at the top and go down. And I was watching the skateboarder react to it, and he's like, "Why wouldn't you start from the bottom and skate up and down? Like if you'd never done it before, like nobody would just throw themselves at it like that."
Yeah.
But like one of the things that seems to emerge from sort of the recountings just now, or reflections, is like, you know, this willingness to sort of go with the flow, be improvisational, like, you know, being able to surrender. I don't know, like I think to me that feels like a sort of core competency around psychedelics, understanding that things are likely to change, and that like at the point where you've already taken the drug, all you can really do is go for the ride and, you know, do your best
buy the ticket.
Yeah, exactly.
Well, so I wanted to speak to Deshay and screens, while and even Russell with you know, chords and such. While one may not want to interact personally, like with screens, or maybe one's favorite video game no longer has its pull, sometimes it's really nice to wander into a well-curated dome where someone else has chosen some music and they're projecting things on the top of the dome, and you don't have to think too much about it. But if you don't like it, you could just leave and go someplace else.
Yeah, obviously the music projection dome.
Yeah,
I wasn't trying to discount the.
You don't have one of those in your backyard?
No, but like even you saying that, I was like, that sounds amazing.
Well, that's what's interesting too about like places like festivals, you know, that folks like capitalists like Angermeyer poo-poo for being, you know, just parties. But there's a lot of like decades and decades of, you know, iterative experiments of like, you know, especially camps that come and, you know, have fine-tuned their experiential dome, or
communal kitchen,
or there's a lot of like harm reduction adjacent tea, not camps, what's it called,
houses.
Like what tea houses, where people can just come and chill out, and like, you know, it helps people if you're feeling a little on edge to just sit down and have someone hand you like a not too hot beverage and just, you know, listen to people talk and the music around and stuff like that. There's a lot of community wisdom around like facilitating really positive experiences that are totally at odds with the blindfolded COVID mask like version of.
And they can shift, an experience that might be veering towards some difficult, like, I don't know, negative, dark jag, and through like not necessarily direction or guiding, because I'm like 25 years into this trip, and I have not hired the services of a guide, but I've met a lot of kind people along the way.
Real quick, I'm just going to report you to Michael Pollan, and he's going to...
Michael Pollan already knows who we are. Thank you very much.
We've given him enough grief.
No, just real quick, our first ever podcast that we did was cited in the Guardian because we gave Pollan shit, and it was like reference, which we thought was funny because we were like complete like neophytes.
I'd say we have an affectionate relationship with Pollan. We don't necessarily agree with Pollan, but
sorry, I didn't mean to interrupt you. But...
Yeah, sorry. I don't know who you
to the point about like the lack of guides or to the camps that have set things up or things like that. You know, I know that there are let's say like less barriered places where that stuff takes place, but also like looking at sort of the big burn as kind of a if not the quintessential sort of space that people think about or discuss, like, and having seen people in psychedelic spaces talk about it as an apolitical event or as something that's open and accessible to everyone. It's like, yeah, if you've got a couple grand to like get your supplies and buy your ticket and get out there, and you can take a week off of work, and like, you know, it's not going to come with backlash from telling people like what you're doing. And, you know, like there's so many things. And then as far as the apoliticalness, like when you look at people taking advantage in those spaces, when you look at the Black Rock Rangers, when you look at the what is it, the board of erotic discourse trying to do like consent discussions and all of that, like, you know, all of those are political projects. And I think like the question Pace likes to ask frequently is sort of this notion of what would it take to sort of make bad trips less likely in society at large. And thinking about the amount of work, you know, Matt, like looking at your reaction when the sort of sound projection dome was proposed, and like, what would it take to be able to have like participatory art installations in a way that's not like Tony Hsieh saying, I'm throwing down $100 million in downtown Las Vegas for me and my friends to run shit. And like, hey, if you want to come participate in that, you know, maybe you can be a lackey, or maybe you can come work for me. Like, you know, like the fundamental social relations in having.
There's a word for that.
Go ahead.
For what you're getting at. It's called public opulence. And it's something that some of the movers and shakers who are trying to go well beyond like the Green New Deal. So like, you know, DSA leadership and others, they've discussed how, look, if we win in certain ways, in terms of degrowth, workers' protection, getting rid of the bullshit and labor, such that you know, luxury and leisure is centered in society, it will change the built environment of our very communities. Because what are we going to do with all that time? And a vision has been put forth. It's just a vision, but I really just want to invoke the concept of public opulence. One of the things that I've noticed living in Latin America for a long time is there's plazas everywhere, where in the United States, in Canada, I assume, there are parking lots instead. It doesn't take that much to pry up asphalt and plant a garden in its place. And the world that we live in is not as rigid and concrete as we think it is. It can be remade in a generation, and it can be done so without bloodshed. It can be done so in a joyful and participatory manner. But wouldn't it be great if we set up community centers that were for enjoyment and collective pleasure? We speak a lot in the psychedelic community about harm reduction, and yet very little about pleasure production.
That's a really good point. I think you really hit the nail on the head there. Is there's so much focus put on making sure you don't have a bad trip, but like, what about having a good trip? Like, what about having an important, like, good experience? It's
the best trip
well,
possible.
to do that, you need to hire a psychedelic coach, and for
And an integration
$59.99
coach.
they will take you on a curated journey.
Well, the other
as
problem
long as they vomit on me.
well,
You want the full experience, don't you?
Yeah.
the problem with your public plazas is, how is Daddy Elon going to accrue enough resources to ensure our future in the stars?
Right. I don't know.
Problems to
there's
think
this
through.
when you criticize kind of the institution of these large corporations coming in and taking over the space, the liberal response is like, I know you were joking with that Daddy Elon, but like the liberal technocratic view of it is, oh, it's not a systemic problem, it's that the wrong people are the ones in control of these systems. So we just need to hand it over to people who are a bit more knowledgeable, and they will then solve our problems for us, and we don't really have to think about it.
Yeah, it's like Douglas Adams said, like, we have to vote, because if we don't vote, the wrong lizards will get elected.
Well, it reminds me too, it's like a point that I made early on when Compass was coming in. I think I said something to the effect of like, we're fortunate that George and Katya, the co-founders of Compass, appear to be such terrible people, because it makes it, or reprehensible, I think was the term I used, because it makes it easier to recognize these bad actions and bad actors and the rest of it. However, like in the future, we may not be so lucky, because they may seem to be people who are of the space, or who seem to be, who claim to be acting in the public interest in ways that are, if not more believable, at least go down a little smoother. And in those cases, you then have to grapple with all of the optics around that, and the fact that like, hey, just give them a chance to work the system. They're doing the best they can from within. Again, ignoring, as you said, the structural and systemic realities.
People in the community who lived long enough to become the villain.
Well, just one point I wanted to say quickly about the public opulence piece is that, like, for a lot of people now, they travel far away to access these therapists. They're not in their home area. Sometimes they're not in their home country or time zone, and they are with strangers. And there's been a lot of abusive, as we were mentioning earlier, practitioners and guides. And one way to reduce the amount of abusive strangers that you run into is to allow for opportunities to trip with your friends and the people close to you, and actually have those experiences be a way that you're strengthening relationships and strengthening community at home, and not something that's just something you do like far away once in a while to reset.
And people
That's
who
something that has to be kept secret,
right? Yeah,
so
exactly.
that it allows for that an abuse of power. You can't come forward because you'll get arrested.
Yeah, exactly.
Right, or even that fear. I remember. So there is a conference in New York called Horizons, and they had an issue where they ended up jettisoning one of the organizers because there were a number of
the MC. Let's be clear.
Yeah. There were a number of complaints of impropriety from a bunch of different people, and in trying to talk about the processes and the procedures that they were putting in place after the fact, they were very clear, if this is how we're going to do it, we're only going to acknowledge it so much. And frankly, if people have further issue, they can reach out to this person who is an attorney at this law firm and this, that, and the other. And I basically said, well, hey, can we talk about the fact that Horizons exists on the back of a criminalized subculture, and that a lot of the people who are coming here may actually not feel comfortable disclosing their experiences to like a legal professional. They may not actually be in any legal jeopardy, but can we talk about some of the realities that this imposes on this situation? And there was sort of the complete dismissal out of hand that this is the best we can do if they don't want to engage with it. But it's like this moment of like, oh, we've got policies and procedures to deal with this, so that we can say we've got policies and procedures to deal with it, not so that we can actually like address the issues and really get into the nitty-gritty of those power differentials in the context of criminalization.
I have a question for Matt, because I think it speaks to what Dave was just saying. You have talked about anarchism as like as like a stance and a philosophy and a way of problem solving and moving through life. And I feel like David was sort of posing those questions to Horizons. They didn't get it. Like what do you, how do you sort of communicate that to people when most people say, oh, you're an anarchist, and that means, I don't know, you like spray painting red A's on things and like I don't know, throwing bricks or something. Like how do you explain this sort of philosophy?
It's not what it means. The way I've always explained it is anarchism is not a series of instructions for how to make an anarchist world. Anarchism is a lens through which to view the world and critique it. So in that sense, the project of anarchism is never complete. There's no such thing as a society where all oppression is eliminated. And anyone who tells you that like we're going to get there is probably not thinking about the question hard enough, in my opinion. But the basic principle is, at least as far as I understand it and apply it, is that by default, power is considered to be illegitimate and must prove itself to be legitimate. And when I say legitimate, I mean beneficial and or necessary. So like a lot of anarchists use, and there's critique of this too, I'm not speaking for everyone, a lot of anarchists use as the example of a legitimate authority is the parent-child relationship. And obviously that's not always the case. There are abusive parents. There are ways that we normalize authority over children that is fucked up and shouldn't be the case. But if your kid is trying to run out into the road, you have the right to go like, hey, you're going to get hit by a car, and kind of stop them from doing that. I think we can agree it is beneficial and necessary that children do not run into the street and get hit by cars. But so as a consequence of that, if you look in the world in that way, it means that structures like capitalism or the state don't meet that burden of proof. And therefore, an anarchist would argue that it is incumbent on us to dismantle those systems and critically, not just leave a power vacuum in their place, replace them with something that is beneficial and necessary.
Standard. Yeah.
Yeah. So like when I talk about, for example, abolishing the police, people will go, oh, well, who's gonna stop all the murderers? Who's gonna stop all the rapists? And it's like, well, first of all, police don't do a great job with that. Anyway. Who's doing it now? Would be my question. But it's like there would be something there to prevent murder. Like no one is saying that we just let murder happen willy-nilly and we're cool with murder. Like it's I think that's kind of a straw man that people often it isn't simply that we tear down these systems and like let it all be Mad Max nonsense. A common anarchist saying, and I'm sorry if I'm speaking too much about it, but it's if you've ever seen the anarchist symbol, the red A that we spray paint on buildings before we throw a brick through the window.
To destroy the symbol.
To destroy the symbol. It's like what are those Buddhist tableaus that they build in sand and then blow away? Mandala, thank you. It's what that symbol is. It's an A within an O, and what that stands for is anarchy is order, which is a very it seems like a contradictory statement to people that are not anarchists, and many who are not anarchists would argue that it is contradictory. I don't. I think that the idea being that like the order imposed by authoritarianism and authority is chaotic. That is the chaos, because that is a tumult. Whereas the order of anarchy is it's natural, right?
It's self-regimented, like it's like autonomous and right, like
adaptive.
Yeah, like say like it comes from natural processes, like it comes
emergent.
Thank you.
There we go.
There we go. That's the word I was looking for.
Well,
is the basic view of it.
That's thank you for that. Seriously. I think that a lot of people that I've spoken to in my own life, way back when I was co-operating a worker-owned construction collective entitled Circle A Contracts and Services, we had a hard time explaining ourselves, to others. And like we still signed contracts and did all kinds of, stuff that you have to do to get by in life. But I mean, I really like took a lot, from your just really simple description of it as a stance. Because I think that many things in life that are worth doing are like never-ending projects, parenting, shaving, these kinds of things.
And I just really want to quickly say thank you because it took watching all of Thought Science channel and also being friends with Dave and Dave sharing like anarchist critiques and stuff in the anarchist library for me to realize that I was an anarchist, and just didn't like realize it because I had a misunderstanding personally about what that term meant. And then once I like between those sources of information, I was like, oh yeah, like this is totally like my perspective. But we do struggle, right, with the people's assumptions around the language of it. But yeah, I mean, just from a personal experience, that your channel really helped me, and I'm sure like we've heard from lots of people for whom that's true as well.
Well, there's something I didn't get to mention that I think I've mentioned previously, but like Dave's work inspired me before I met Dave. Nishay's work inspired me before I met Nishay, specifically to become more public. Like it was, a couple of things, but Nishay's coming out of the psychedelic closet was a watershed moment, for my own development. And I reached out on Twitter. And now we hang out all the time, and like, and your videos have just been really like useful, and obviously like hilarious and entertaining, and I don't know, and it's just, and then Russell, I mean, Jesus, like Russell has just done so much, like every day, like dogged research into things that are illuminating.
Talk about fixating.
Yeah, no, seriously. Like somebody digging through like documents and patents and statements from fucking Corporadelia CEOs nobody's ever heard of, and tracing down mining connections and stuff. Like the truth is that we need each other. Like we need communities to be our full selves. Otherwise, like this atomizing, isolating, like toxic neoliberal individualism, like this is beneficial to people who want to sell you things, but if we're able to, and we have the time, to benefit from each other's talents, we have the interpersonal skills that we're less traumatized individuals, so that we're not triggered by everything and everyone all the time. Like we can build another and a better world. Like absolutely, I 100% believe that.
And Matt, just because you're saying like no one knows if you're a good guy or whatever you put on, you have a character, etc.
You're very convincing though.
You're very convincing character.
Yes.
But I do want to say that like finding your channel and like really like over since like COVID, and just having that reliable schedule to like, every Friday, gotta look forward to a new Thoughts on video, just really has helped me a lot just with the stresses of like quarantine and like losing my job, losing my healthcare, losing my, antidepressants and everything. And just your vulnerability and, even if it is partially a performance, but just being willing to say that, anxiety is a thing, and just being forthcoming and okay with like being open in that sense, like even if it is like not you as a whole person, like it really has been like profoundly helpful for through this difficult time. So I just wanted, while we had you, for just to really say thank you for that.
I mean, I'm not crying, if that's what you think. It's really dusty in this room, so it's I don't have feelings, so it's fine. No, thank you very much. It's to be clear, it's not that I want people to think of me as a bad person. I'm very touched that people view me and think, oh, he seems like a nice guy. But what I think is the danger is sometimes people create that public image and then use it to get close to people. And that, like, the most obvious version of that would be like groomers, right?
Yeah.
But beyond that, like, don't forget, this is also my job and I do make money from it. Mm-hmm. And so it behooves me to kind of build, like, if I wanted to lean into that and go like, oh, I'm such a great guy, and but you know what I'm saying? Like, is this is this registering? I don't know.
Well, like, some of the things that we cover are these, coaches and guru attempts that people are constantly making in the psychedelic space. And what we focus on a lot at Psymposia is the gap between rhetoric and action. And so all I can say is, like, I haven't seen video evidence of you tripping that old lady, but when we do, we will write an article about it.
I mean, there's also like a thing where I feel like I hear a certain like desire for, it's not just like the harm reduction about like, oh, what characters could do with parasocial relations and play that out and take advantage and this, that, and the other. Like, there's also, it sounds like a certain desire towards like authenticity and acknowledgement of your own like humanity, right? Like the fact that, like, as a human being, I'm sure you have shitty days just like the rest of us. And like in that context, having been in front of an audience giving a speech where people are moved by it, and at the end they want to project all of the ways that made them feel onto you. They want to tell you how wonderful you are because, oh my God, here was a moment of inspiration and hope or joy or whatever. And to then suddenly like need to be the container for that outpouring of emotion, when you're also like, well, and I know all the like, yesterday was an off day and I did all this shit, and like trying to bring it back to like, I don't know, like I don't, it feels like the appropriate label would be one of humility, right? Like to try to actually like, just be honest about sort of who we are.
Or and also to think like, someone gets that, like, that comfort from you and gets that you help them in a bad situation, you help them deal with the problem they're having, and then it uplifts them and that gives them some sort of strength. What happens then if they find out later that you are this horrible person, and then like all of that they got from it now is poisoned in a way that I think is very, like, the whole, this is some extremely online bullshit, but the Game Grumps guy getting outed, that is like, that has fucked me up all week, man. Like, it's just been a total bummer. And I know myself well enough to know, and I know this is what a predator would say, I know that I would not predate on people. But if I don't call it out when I see people forming that, like, giving me that power, I'm contributing to a culture where someone else might.
So I want to speak to that, because actually, like, one of the things that I've seen in anarchist writing, and I like absolutely can't provide a citation right now, but is that, like, it's not that anarchists believe in the inherent goodness and I don't know, just like nobility of the human character. It's that they actually recognize that structures that allow the worst elements of our characters to flourish, like, well, those are the structures that we need to criticize and take down, right? And we need to build specific structures where those kinds of abuses are at the very least less likely. And one of the things that we have tried to do at Psymposia is to create social costs for people who are behaving poorly or even atrociously by describing them and pointing to them and making them somewhat undeniable. Well, that hasn't earned us a lot of friends, but we actually get a lot of mail from people who do seem to appreciate that. You know, there's value.
Well, I appreciate it if it helps.
Absolutely. But there's also a thing, it's like to that point, right? Like when people say, well, what will your anarchist society do with sociopaths and liars? And it's like, what does your society do with them? Like it elevates, like literally, I had a conversation with a frat boy during I think this was also back around Occupy.
That was your first mistake. No,
where it was just like mind numbing. But then also to the point about, what was it, the grooming and people being defensive of that, right? Like looking at the things with Martin Ball, looking at the things with various other people who we've identified as engaging in disturbing or abusive behavior, like people who come out of the woodwork to defend them precisely because if this person is doing the things that they've said, if this person is engaging in inappropriate actions, oh my God, what does that mean? I mean, Keith Raniere still has people outside his jail cell, you know, sticking up for him.
Yeah, and actually the logic that you're describing with like people being let down, it actually is like very similar to recently there's been an ayahuasca shaman who has been called out for being like a
groomer,
yeah, and one of the people in his circle was saying to the person who was coming out that they shouldn't speak about it because look at like all of the people who have benefited, all the healing, they'll lose that healing because this like great person will be revealed to not be as great and it will impact. But it was just very similar to how you were describing like the effect of finding out something bad about.
Yeah, and there is definitely like truth to that their experiences are going to be poisoned by that a little, but I think in his situation,
colored,
he was saying
poison,
not colored, but he was saying like, oh, you shouldn't come out because you don't want to do this, and that was like a weird thing in that scenario, but it did.
I mean, it's not that different from people saying like, oh, we shouldn't. Bill Cosby is such a positive role model. Oh, we shouldn't. He shouldn't be held accountable for his crimes.
Right.
No, that's. But Brian, to your point, you were talking about anarchists not viewing people as essentially good.
Yeah.
I'm going to butcher a quote from Kropotkin, but the gist of it is, if we are not worthy of being free, then how can we be worthy of ruling?
Yeah.
Right. If people are so bad, why would you then give power to them?
Yeah, there's an early thought slime video on human nature that is along those lines. I recommend watching.
Or also mutual aid, a factor of evolution, also is where that video is mostly cribbing its ideas from. But it's okay because intellectual property is theft.
That's right.
Yeah.
Also, he's been dead for 100 years, so it's
in the public domain. You know?
Yeah.
I mean, I think look, there's something to be said about like engaging with sort of intractable problems and really trying to think deeply about them. Like I spent a decade of my life thinking about climate change. None of that thinking is likely to solve the problem. But it's going to like reorient the way that, you know, I move through life. And I'm not talking about like, I'm going to recycle more or something, but like, I happen to believe that like I mean, climate change is actually a great model for this. The ideas that we convince ourselves of individually and as a society, and both of them feed into one another. You know, there is this intersubjective space where like our ideas, our relationships, and our actions all create this like meta structure. And it, you know, it matters. And I think a lot about this in the psychedelic space because of the meaning magnifying attributes of psychedelics. They can drastically shift things. I argue that there's no directionality to that shift, and we should be very careful. But I guess what I'm saying is just like, you know, it's worth it. It's not just navel gazing or simple philosophizing, like
It doesn't have to be.
Yeah, it doesn't have to be, or just like I don't know. I think people sort of dismiss dismiss it all as like wokeism, and yet like I think that most people are really trying to figure out like that age-old philosophical question, like how shall I be? And I think it's worth engaging in because there are like material consequences to whatever answer we land upon. How shall we be?
I think, it's like, well, people often say to me, like, do you think there will be a revolution in your lifetime? And it's like, that doesn't, what would that change for me if I thought that? Like, how would I behave differently, Also to the degree, I think that, and we'll get into, here's the real shit.
Oh boy.
Hit that blunt. We're going to get to the real shit now. The revolution isn't something that happens because a bunch of people storm the Bastille. The revolution is how people react to oppression. Everywhere that there is oppression, there is consummately a revolution to fight it. The same way that like slavery didn't end because of the Civil War. Slavery ended because of the diligent work of slave revolts and abolitionists and the combined efforts of thousands of people that started the moment the first person was put in chains,
Damn right. Yeah.
And it's still ongoing because it's not over. That fight isn't over because there's still slavery in the United States.
Well, and since
the
we've
13th
already...
Amendment.
Yeah, sorry. Please. No, finish that one. That's worth...
Sorry, just to contextualize that, the 13th Amendment outlawed slavery except as a punishment for a crime.
Yep.
So there's technically more African Americans enslaved right now than there were at the height of antebellum slavery in the United States. So,
yeah, and I was going to make the point that while we've been sort of waxing poetic about anarchism at various points, I mean, this also brings up that notion of like anarchism as tendencies, right? And sort of as being like ongoing processes that are constituted by people deciding to engage in ways that make anarchism possible and that sustain it and that like bring forth, like produce the conditions that allow for anarchic organization. And like this is not something that just gets set into motion or that we reach some like ultimate state where cool, anarchy unlocked. I mean, this is the thing.
No states.
Right.
States.
Not even states of being. But this is just it, right? Like with the point you made earlier about like utopia, it's like, even if we wanted to accept the premise that utopia could exist, that it was an achievable state, like it couldn't possibly be static. So, yeah. Well, so like if you could achieve utopia, right? If you could produce some sort of utopian condition and it existed, it would still, like, life is dynamic. Everything is always in flux. Everything always changes. So like any sort of utopia would sort of have to be a perpetual becoming where things would shift and then need to be met. And again, you would need the conditions that allow for people to meet that in their daily lives. Sorry, Matt, it looks like you want to.
No, it's just, I wanted to jump in with, I think that if you say that there's no reason to engage in this process because it could go on forever, it is like, as you say, saying that because utopia is impossible, we should never try to make the world better.
Right, right.
Well, and that's, I'm reminded of, I have on this bookshelf, the Contradictionary, which is just a bunch of words defined in silly ways, but there's one that talks about prefiguration and discusses the fact that, like, you know, the sort of any of the trappings you could imagine, like if you go to a place like Google, right? Like they have already prefigured a society or a sort of sub-society in which all of the materialist capitalist trappings you could imagine are made available for those who are willing to sort of swim through this sea of blood to get there. You know, you have your 5-star chefs, you have your swim in place pool, you have your free childcare, you have, you know, the rest of it. And just thinking about like what it would take to make that, you know, accessible to all, what it would take to actually just restructure things to imagine that sort of public opulence. Yeah.
But what if it's all a mistake and we make the world better for nothing?
Well, you know, that's a risk I'm willing to take.
So I'm reminded, particularly with Matt's comment on the process that started when the first person was put in chains, of now I forgot the movie. The movie is the quote is, "I will not be subject to criminal abuse."
Oh,
and the
Cloud
movie
Atlas?
is Cloud Atlas. Yeah. The book is worth it as well, but it it travels through time and sort of engages with multiple forms of oppression and multiple movements of abolition. And I don't know, it's always been one of my favorites, with that basic sort of statement of "I will not be subject to criminal abuse." But also like language, you were Matt, you were talking about like that which is legitimate, and some of the things, like as a journalistic outlet, like we sort of pay attention to style guide, like what kinds of language do we use generally. One of the things that we typically avoid, particularly because we talk about criminalized activities a lot, even when we're describing the actions of people that we find extremely awful, like puking on intoxicated people's faces. We typically don't, for money, yeah. While you're also intoxicated, we typically don't describe them as criminal. And when we're talking about corporations like taking over things, we don't describe it as unlawful. We talk about it as like an enclosure. And I don't necessarily feel the need to appeal to legitimacy, because the root word is law. So I don't know. I mean, a lot of times what we talk about are things that are antisocial, things that are harmful. And I don't know, I think that there's an avoidance to appealing to arbitrary authority that we try to adhere to. It's
the slogan, "Be gay, do crime."
Yeah.
It's, I had that on a sticker on my laptop when I was in computer school. And someone pointed at it and said, "Are you gay?" And I was like, "Well, I just think it's good advice." And they were like, "Well, how's it good advice to do crime?" And I was like, I do not have the time to explain that to you. Go to this YouTube channel. I got a lot of videos about it.
That's great. That's great.
But it's also not particularly descriptive, right? To talk about things as illegal, or to like in the way, like, it's amazing.
Well, because what's illegal and legal changes over time and across eras,
Yeah, and personally,
well, like jaywalking is illegal.
Yep.
Yeah, and it was invented to prevent operators of motor vehicles from litigation for running people down the street.
Oh, I didn't realize that. That's great.
Yeah, the term jay used to mean like hayseed, like a hick or something. It's like, look at these jays walking on the road.
Wow.
I mean, so I don't know. How are we all feeling here? Like, should we start to wrap up here?
Yeah, we've been on for a while.
I think we just hit 3 hours.
Oh, did we?
It's a good round
around there.
It's just really, I know I've kind of harped on this, but it's really like been like a dream come true to be able to chat with you, and just,
so much fun.
and also both for you specifically, and like how much we appreciate your channel, but also like what it represents in terms of like trying to reach out to like other people in the left who aren't necessarily like in our same everyday communities, but who are, on side, and just trying to work to shift the Overton window a bit on psychedelia, towards away from the capitalist nonsense that it's kind of running towards.
Well, if I could turn that around on you, I think that what I do is relatively easy. I sit in front of a camera and I make dick jokes, essentially. That's my job. You guys, and I say guys, I don't mean to
pejoratively.
Y'all, I said, because you know what? I'm in my head because when you say y'all, there's certain people online that are like, that's AVE. I'm like, no, it's not. People say y'all. It's a good term. But
Yes.
all of you are out there doing the real work. You are speaking real truth to power, and I appreciate the hell out of it. And
Thanks.
yeah.
Well, everyone listening should go check out Thought Slime's channel on YouTube, and he has a Patreon, and that is how Grumble Tums, I believe, survives. So
Yeah.
we'll do make sure that he doesn't die. Or they don't die.
The adorable woodland critter that will starve and die if I don't get enough engagement and money.
Yeah. Also, if you're into horror, the YouTube channel is Scaredy Cats. A lot of great shit there. I mean,
not to be confused with the podcast of the same name. It's youtube.com/scaredycatstv.
Oh, okay, good to know. Look, there's only one YouTube channel that features wet puppets to the gratuity that Scaredy Mats does
So far.
Delightful. And also, thanks for listening this far, and check out our Patreon. Feel free to support us.
Please.
It goes a long way.
Matt also has a Patreon for
Yeah.
Thought Slime. Yeah.
Okay. Well, this is amazing. Thank you so much.
Yeah.
Thank you so
thanks,
much.
Matt.
I cannot stress enough. I really enjoyed this conversation.